There are universes that are loud, filled with the clamor of machines, battles, and choices made too quickly. But this one was different. It opened like a whisper, like a memory that was never quite your own, but still somehow familiar. And in this quiet stretch of stars, Rick found himself pausing, not because he wanted to, but because the silence left him with no other choice. It was a universe that seemed to breathe slower, softer, as if made for resting. And before I take you further, let me say this first. We truly love and care for you. This story isn't just for Rick and Morty, it's for you too, listening in the stillness of your night, maybe with your eyes half closed, maybe holding on to a thought you're ready to let drift away. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. Rick never liked to admit he needed anything. He liked to say the word genius as if it were a shield, as if it excused the hollowness that sometimes echoed in him. But in this universe, the shield didn't quite hold. Here the stars were quieter, and the edges of reality softer. And beside him, Morty shuffled nervously, the way he always did, rubbing his hands together like he wasn't sure what to do with them. Rick glanced at him and almost said something sharp, some joke to cut through the stillness. But instead he found himself just watching. Morty's awkward little movements, the way his shoulders hunched and then straightened, the way he kept peeking up at Rick as though searching for permission to speak. It was all so small, so ordinary, and yet in this place it felt like the only sound that mattered. Morty's voice broke the silence, quiet and hesitant. Rick, this place feels weird, not in the usual portal way, just different. Rick cleared his throat, fumbling for the comfort of sarcasm, but the words didn't land. Yeah, Morty, different. You think you're the first one to notice? Congratulations, kid, real breakthrough. He said it in the old way, but softer, as though his heart wasn't fully behind it. The truth was, Morty was right. Something about this universe made Rick uneasy. Not dangerous uneasy, just vulnerable. Like a mirror that reflected not what you wanted, but what you were. They walked further through a field of pale grass that seemed to glow faintly under starlight. Each step sounded muted, like the world itself wanted them to walk gently. Morty bent down once, picking up a pebble that shimmered faintly and rolled it between his fingers. Rick saw how Morty's face lit with quiet curiosity. The same boyish wonder that had annoyed him 1,000 times before. But tonight, here, it didn't annoy him, it steadied him. Rick looked away quickly, grumbling, "Don't get attached. It's just a rock." But Morty didn't answer. He just kept holding it, as if it mattered. The silence stretched, not the heavy kind, not the kind that presses down like a weight. This was a silence that invited you in, that told you it was okay to rest a little. And Rick, against all instincts, found himself breathing slower. He thought about all the universes where he had kept moving, building, running, drinking, yelling. All the universes where Morty had followed him, tripping over himself, trying so hard to keep up. And now, here, the roles felt blurred. Rick was the one slowing down. Morty was the one who seemed steady, even if he didn't know it. The boy turned suddenly and looked at Rick. His words were simple. "Rick, you okay?" Rick blinked. He wasn't used to that question being asked without an angle. Usually people wanted to know what he could invent, what he could fix, how he could save. But Morty was asking about him. Just him. And Rick didn't have an answer ready. "Yeah, kid," he muttered, his voice low. "Fine. Just thinking." They reached a hill, small and soft, and sat down without planning to. Rick pulled his flask out of habit, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't take a sip. He just held it, rolling it between his palms. Morty lay back in the grass, arms folded under his head, staring up at the stars like they were telling him a secret. Rick watched him for a while, quietly. "You ever wonder," Rick said suddenly, "if maybe you're the one keeping me together, instead of the other way around?" Morty turned his head, surprised. His eyes were wide, but there was no joke in them, no nervous laugh. Just the honesty of a boy who had followed a man through more nightmares than most could imagine. "I don't know, Rick. I just try to be here, you know." Rick huffed, almost a laugh, almost a sigh. "Yeah, you're here. That's the thing." The wind moved gently through the glowing grass, carrying with it a sound that almost felt like humming, like the universe itself was trying to lull them. Morty closed his eyes and Rick sat still, staring up at the sky. He wasn't ready to admit anything, not fully, but for the first time in what felt like centuries, he allowed himself to feel something that wasn't calculation, wasn't chaos, wasn't escape. It was need. Quiet, reluctant, but real. Rick stretched his legs out, leaning back on his elbows, mirroring Morty without meaning to. The stars above seemed endless but not empty. They looked like something gentle, something watching. And Rick thought just for a moment that maybe this universe hadn't pulled them in by accident. Maybe it had wanted him to slow down, to see, to remember that even a genius needs someone. Morty's breathing grew slower, deeper, already drifting. Rick didn't disturb him. He just let the silence cover them both like a blanket, the night, soft and unhurried. And in that quiet, Rick whispered words no one else would ever hear. "Maybe I need you more than you'll ever need me." The stars, kind as ever, kept the secret. The night lingered like a gentle hand resting on their shoulders, unhurried and without demand. Morty had drifted into sleep, his chest rising and falling in that uneven rhythm of a boy who still carried pieces of childhood inside him. Rick sat beside him, listening without trying to. Each breath was a reminder of presence, of something steady. Rick told himself he was only waiting until the kid woke up, but deep down he knew he wasn't ready to leave the stillness just yet. He tried looking away from Morty, focusing instead on the sky. The stars above this place weren't like others he had seen. They didn't just burn or flare, they shimmered softly, like embers floating in water, each one refusing to outshine the next. Rick tilted his head, pretending to calculate their movements, but really he was just watching. For once, he allowed himself to do nothing more. Memories crept in where silence left space. Rick remembered Morty as a much younger boy, barely tall enough to see over the counter, tugging at his sleeve, asking questions that had no neat answers. Why are stars so far apart? Do they get lonely out there? Rick had brushed it off with muttered physics, distracted equations, but secretly he'd thought about it later, alone. He thought about it again now, staring at these stars that somehow felt less alone. Morty stirred in his sleep, mumbling something Rick couldn't quite catch. The boy's hand opened, and the glowing pebble he had picked earlier rolled from his palm into the grass. Rick picked it up before it could vanish in the shadows. It felt strangely warm in his hand, like it had borrowed Morty's touch. He turned it over between his fingers, frowning, but the frown wasn't sharp. It was thoughtful, almost tender. When Morty woke, the sky had shifted. A thin silver dawn brushed the edges of the horizon, though no sun revealed itself. He blinked sleepily, rubbing his eyes before glancing at Rick. Did you stay up all night?" Rick grunted, slipping the pebble into his coat pocket without thinking. "What's it to you, kid? Somebody's got to keep watch, right?" Morty yawned, stretching his arms, the innocence of the motion pulling at Rick's chest. "You didn't have to. This place, it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels kind of safe." Rick opened his mouth to argue, but the words never arrived. Morty was right. There was no looming threat here, no danger chasing them from one dimension to the next. The danger was quieter, the danger of facing himself, of realizing that maybe he didn't want to run this time. They began walking again, the grass brushing softly against their legs. The world around them shifted subtly, as though it responded to their movement. Hills melted into valleys, paths opened gently where they needed to. It was as if the universe was guiding them with a hand they couldn't see. Morty pointed ahead. "Rick, look, water!" A lake unfolded. Before them, its surface still and shimmering like glass. The reflection of the sky stretched across it, stars mirrored in water so clearly it was hard to tell where the heavens ended. Morty crouched by the edge, dipping his fingers in, and gasped. "It's warm." Rick knelt beside him, more out of curiosity than trust. The water rippled gently, carrying no chill, only comfort. He cupped some in his palm and let it slip through his fingers, glowing faintly as it fell back into the lake. Morty laughed quietly, the sound small but genuine. Rick hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd heard Morty laugh without fear behind it. They sat by the shore, not needing to speak. Eventually, Morty broke the silence. "Hey, Rick, do you ever think about when I was younger? Like, when we first started going on these adventures?" Rick tensed slightly, unsure where the question was headed. "Yeah, kid, I remember. You were clumsy, terrified half the time. Couldn't run 5 steps without tripping over your own shoelaces." Morty chuckled softly. "Yeah. But I didn't stop, did I? Even when it was scary?" Rick didn't answer right away. He stared into the water, watching their reflections. His face looked older here, lined with years he tried to ignore. Morty's reflection looked brighter somehow, as if the light clung to him. Finally, Rick said, "No, you didn't stop." Morty leaned back on his hands, squinting at the horizon. "Sometimes I think maybe I only kept going because you were there. Even if you yelled or messed everything up or scared me, you were still there." The words sank deep, and Rick felt them like a weight and a balm at the same time. He wanted to brush it off, make a joke, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he muttered, "Maybe I was the one who kept going because you were there." Morty turned, surprised, but Rick avoided his eyes, tossing a pebble into the water. It skipped once, then sank, glowing faintly as it disappeared beneath the surface. The ripples spread slowly, each one calmer than the last, until the lake was still again. They lingered there for hours, the day unfolding without urgency. Birds with translucent wings drifted overhead, their calls soft and echoing like flutes. Morty pointed them out excitedly, naming them things that made no sense, laughing when Rick rolled his eyes, but didn't stop him. The boy's joy was unpolished, unguarded, and Rick found himself cataloguing every sound, every gesture, like he was afraid of forgetting. As the light dimmed again into twilight, Morty lay down on the grass beside the lake, humming softly. It wasn't a tune Rick recognized, just a string of notes tumbling from the boy's half-dreaming mind. Rick sat beside him, the glowing pebble still heavy in his pocket, and wondered why it felt like the most valuable thing he'd ever carried. He wanted to say something real, but the words tangled, and knotted before they could leave his mouth. So instead, he whispered only to the stars, low enough that Morty wouldn't stir. "I don't deserve you, kid, but maybe I'll try to." The stars flickered gently as though agreeing. Rick lay back then, closing his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. Sleep didn't come easy to him, not in any universe. But here, with Morty's hum drifting into the air and the soft lake rippling nearby, his breath slowed, and without meaning to, Rick allowed himself to drift toward rest. For once, he didn't fight it. The morning arrived quietly, as if it had been waiting its turn for centuries. Light spilled over the hills in pale strokes, painting the grass in shades of silver and green that almost hurt the eyes with their softness. Morty was awake first, though he didn't move immediately. He lay there, listening to the world breathe, letting the calm sink into him. Rick watched him from a few paces away, feeling a strange, unfamiliar tug in his chest. Not urgency, not calculation, but something quieter. Rick had never been good at quiet. His mind was usually a storm, crackling with ideas, explosions, inventions, chaos. But here, in this universe, the storm had softened to a drizzle, almost imperceptible. He wondered if it was the place, or if it was Morty, the small, steady presence that seemed to slow time by simply existing. Morty sat up and stretched, his hair falling into his eyes. "Rick, what are we going to do today?" Rick hesitated. In most worlds, he would have answered quickly, experiment, explore, escape, fix. But here he realized he didn't know. "I dunno, kid," he muttered. "Maybe, we'll just walk, see where it goes." Morty smiled, the kind of smile that feels like a secret shared only with the universe. Okay. They walked without urgency. The paths twisted gently through fields that shimmered faintly, each plant seeming to lean toward them in silent curiosity. Strange flowers opened and closed as they passed, their petals glowing in soft rhythms. Morty bent to touch them, and the petals twitched like they recognized him. Rick didn't comment, just let him, though a flicker of wonder passed behind his eyes. At one point, Morty picked up a stick and traced patterns in the soil, half drawing, half writing. Rick watched, fascinated by the simplicity of the act. In a universe where he could create weapons that tore reality itself apart, here he found himself mesmerized by a child doodling. There was something profoundly grounding about it, a reminder that existence could be both vast and intimate at once. Morty looked up at him with earnest eyes. "Rick, do you think other universes ever get quiet like this?" Rick shook his head slowly. "Nah, most of them are screaming and burning. You don't usually get a universe that whispers at you." Morty frowned, thinking. "I kinda like it, though. Makes it easier to hear stuff, like each other." Rick found himself staring at the boy, and the words he almost said hung in the air. "Stuff like what?" he wanted to ask, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded, the motion small, almost imperceptible. They arrived at a grove where the trees were tall, their leaves like translucent emerald glass. Sunlight passed through them, scattering rainbows on the soft moss below. Morty ran his fingers along the trunks, laughing quietly when the colors shimmered across his hands. Rick crouched beside him, watching, noticing the tiny flickers of joy that seemed to emanate from Morty naturally without effort. "You know," Morty said, "I never thought I'd like this kind of stuff. Trees, light, peace." Rick snorted softly. "You've been through hell, kid. You deserve a few quiet mornings." Morty tilted his head, curious. "Even if we're stuck in some weird universe?" Rick hesitated, then shrugged. "Even then, maybe especially then. Some universes don't get the memo about peace. This one apparently does. They walked deeper into the grove, finding a small clearing where the ground was soft, almost like it had been carved for sitting. Morty plopped down, rolling onto his back, hands behind his head. Rick followed suit reluctantly, leaning against a tree trunk. The air smelled faintly of flowers and something undefinable, like a memory of a childhood he'd never had. Rick watched Morty for a long while, realizing something he hadn't allowed himself to think. This boy had grown. Not in the usual sense of height or strength, but in patience, in observation, in quiet resilience. Morty could face fear without panicking. He could listen without judgment. He could stay present when everything else screamed to run. Rick had built worlds and destroyed them, but Morty had built a kind of peace in himself, a small, stubborn island of calm. Morty hummed softly, a tune that drifted lazily in the grove, half song, half lullaby. Rick didn't realize he had closed his eyes until Morty's hand brushed against his arm. Startled, he looked, only to see Morty smiling gently. "Hey, you okay?" Rick swallowed, surprised by the softness in his own chest. Yeah, kid. Just thinking." Morty tilted his head, curious but not insistent. That was something Rick noticed too. Morty didn't demand answers, didn't push too hard. He simply existed alongside Rick, steady as the grove, and that was more comforting than Rick would ever admit. Time passed differently here. Minutes stretched like the soft shadows between the trees. Rick found himself not wanting to calculate, not wanting to plan, not wanting to move, just being. And Morty, humming, lying in the light, made it possible. Eventually Morty turned over, propping himself on one elbow. "Rick, do you think I make a difference?" Rick blinked. Not a usual question, not one about science or survival. This was about something softer, something he hadn't acknowledged in himself. "You already do, kid," he said finally. "More than you know. I notice, even if I don't always say it." Morty smiled faintly, eyes half closed, watching the light dance through the leaves. "Good, because I need you too, you know. Not just to fix stuff, I mean, just you." Rick stared at him, the words sinking deeper than he expected. He wanted to brush them off, but the soft truth pressed in. Maybe he didn't just need to lead, to invent, to escape. Maybe he just needed this. Morty, quiet, presence. Life, small and unassuming, but steadfast. The grove began to dim as the sun shifted, the shadows lengthening into a soft purple twilight. Morty yawned and rolled onto his back again, humming into the fading light. Rick leaned back against the tree, feeling a rare kind of stillness settle over him. Not rest exactly, not peace exactly, but something that felt like it could become both if he allowed it. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let the grove, the light, the soft hum, and Morty's quiet existence seep into him, patching something he hadn't realized was broken. And for the first time in a long while, Rick allowed himself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, he could stay like this for longer than a few stolen moments. As stars began to pierce the twilight, delicate and patient, Rick closed his eyes, whispering to the universe and to himself. Maybe we're exactly where we're supposed to be. For now. And somewhere, faintly, the grove seemed to agree, carrying their presence like a lullaby. The day had unfolded like a slow river, gentle and unhurried, yet carrying a quiet sense of inevitability. Rick and Morty wandered into a valley where the grass swayed like it remembered the touch of every foot that had walked upon it. The light here was softer than before, diffused through a mist that smelled faintly of rain and old stories. Morty's steps were careful, almost reverent, and Rick found himself matching them, not out of caution, but because the world seemed to ask for it. Morty paused and plucked a feather from the ground, holding it up to the pale sun. "Look, Rick, isn't it kind of perfect?" Rick squinted at it, ready to dismiss it with a joke. But he didn't. For once, the feather felt like more than a feather. It was delicate, light, and carried with it a sense of possibility. He nodded once. "Yeah, kind of perfect." The boy smiled softly and tucked the feather behind his ear. "I like mornings here, even if nothing really happens." Rick laughed quietly, a sound unfamiliar in its softness. "Sometimes that's the point, Morty. Nothing happening. Everything happening all at once is exhausting." Morty tilted his head, thinking. "So, this is like the universe telling us to slow down?" Rick hesitated. He wasn't sure he believed that universes ever spoke, not in words. But maybe they did, in gestures, in the way the wind moved through grass, in the soft tilt of the earth under your feet. Maybe it's just letting us breathe. And sometimes, kid, that's more important than 100 adventures. They continued walking, the valley opening to a gentle river that mirrored the sky above. Rick knelt to touch the water, letting his fingers break the glassy surface. It rippled slowly, calm and forgiving. Morty followed, leaning over the edge and dipping his hands in. He laughed softly at the coolness, and Rick noticed how small, how human that laughter felt compared to the usual chaos of screams and explosions that usually followed them. "I think I like it when things are just soft," Morty said quietly, watching the water. Rick didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about every universe they had ever escaped from, every portal they had jumped through, every life they had almost destroyed. And in that list, Morty's soft presence was a rare constant, an anchor Rick had ignored far too often. Morty splashed a little water toward Rick, laughing. "Hey, don't look so serious, it's just water." Rick caught a droplet on his sleeve and let it slide down. "Serious is just habit, kid, but yeah, maybe this counts as not serious." They wandered along the riverbank, finding a fallen tree that formed a natural bridge. Morty jumped across first, steady on his feet. Rick followed, careful not to slip, but also not wanting to admit he found the act of crossing it comforting. On the other side, the world opened into a grove of strange, luminescent mushrooms that glowed faintly in hues of blue and violet. Morty gasped softly. "Rick, these are beautiful." Rick crouched beside him, inspecting the cluster. "Yeah, universe didn't skimp on weird beauty this time, huh?" Morty smiled, brushing the tip of one mushroom gently with his finger. I think it likes us here, like it knows we need calm." Rick nodded slowly, looking around the grove. The mushrooms swayed slightly, almost like a soft exhale. And for the first time in a long while, Rick allowed himself to exhale too, letting the tension of countless worlds leave him in tiny waves. Morty plopped down onto the soft moss, closing his eyes. "Rick, we could stay here forever." Rick crouched beside him, hand resting on the moss but not touching Morty. "Forever is a lot, kid, but yeah. For now we can stay, we can just be." Morty hummed softly, a lullaby-like sound that drifted into the air and mingled with the faint glow of the mushrooms. Rick felt it tug at something buried deep, a softness he had ignored for too long. He closed his eyes, letting the hum and the light fill the spaces inside him. They stayed like that for hours, time stretching gently, undefined. Morty's breathing slowed, rhythmic, steady, and Rick found himself watching the movement of his chest, noting how something so small could make such a difference. It was a quiet revelation. Strength wasn't always loud. Presence wasn't always dramatic. Some of the most powerful things were simply steady, alive, and gentle. Rick whispered softly, more to himself than to Morty, "I should have noticed sooner, but maybe noticing now is enough." The boy stirred slightly, smiling in his sleep, humming still. Rick looked around the grove again, at the light, the mushrooms, the calm river flowing nearby. And he realized that adventure didn't always mean running, fighting, or surviving. Sometimes adventure meant noticing, observing, listening, breathing. Rick reached into his pocket and felt the pebble Morty had given him earlier, warm still from the boy's hands. He turned it over slowly, thinking about all the universes, all the escapes, all the chaos they had survived. And he understood, finally, that what mattered most wasn't what they had done or built or destroyed. What mattered was that they were here, together. As the pale sun dipped low, spilling a gentle golden light through the mist, Rick leaned back and let himself sink into the soft moss. Morty's hum continued, steady and simple, wrapping around him like a blanket. For once, Rick didn't need to fix anything. He didn't need to invent, escape, or outsmart the universe. He only needed to be here, breathing in the calm, feeling the warmth of a presence that mattered more than any science or invention ever could. He closed his eyes, whispering softly, almost afraid to disturb the fragile peace. Maybe this is what we've been missing. And the mushrooms swayed gently, the river shimmered faintly, and the valley seemed to sigh in agreement. For this moment, and maybe just this one, everything was exactly as it should be. The afternoon lingered lazily, stretched across the valley like honey spilling slowly from a jar. Rick and Morty wandered through a grove of tall, thin trees whose leaves shimmered faintly with every shift of the wind. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and wildflowers, a scent that pressed softly against their memories, teasing out fragments of long-forgotten afternoons, laughter, and quiet conversations. Morty bent down to examine a patch of tiny, glowing mushrooms that clustered near a tree root. He traced his fingers over them delicately, careful not to crush their fragile light. "Rick, they're like little lanterns," he whispered, his voice small but full of awe. Rick crouched beside him, nodding slowly. "Yeah, lanterns, little pieces of calm." He didn't add the usual sarcasm, didn't need to. Here, everything was simple, gentle, and subtle. Morty's wonder made it so. The boy looked up at him, eyes wide, the glow of the mushrooms reflecting softly in them. "Do you think the universe ever makes stuff just for us?" Rick hesitated, unused to thinking like that. Most universes, most worlds, had demanded survival, chaos, or brilliance. But here he allowed himself to imagine the possibility. Maybe it's not about making it for us, kid. Maybe it's just letting us notice it." Morty nodded, satisfied with that. "I like noticing." He smiled, brushing his hands together to clear off imaginary dust from the mushrooms. "Makes me feel, alive, even when it's quiet." Rick leaned back against the nearest tree, letting the soft light of the grove spill across his features. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this. This simple presence, this slow unfolding of life around them. Morty's quiet excitement, his little discoveries, had become something more than amusement or distraction. They were anchors, tiny and unassuming, that held Rick in a way no invention or portal ever had. They wandered further, the grove opening into a clearing where the grass swayed like waves across a gentle sea. Morty ran his hands through it, laughing quietly as the strands bent and curled around his fingers. Rick followed slowly, deliberately, careful not to break the delicate balance of the moment. Rick, Morty said after a long pause, do you ever think about when we first started going on these adventures, like the really scary ones? Rick grunted, rolling his eyes as if to dismiss the thought. Yeah, kid, all the time. You tripping over yourself, me yelling, explosions, screaming, fun stuff. Morty laughed softly, but there was a hint of seriousness beneath it. I wasn't just scared. I learned stuff about you, about me, about the way we handle things. Rick felt the words tug at him unexpectedly. Morty was right. Through every chaotic portal, every universe-twisting escape, every accident they had survived, the boy had grown. Not just taller, not just braver, but wiser, quieter, more present. And Rick had missed it, too busy to notice. You notice, kid? Rick muttered, almost to himself. Morty smiled faintly. Yeah, I notice you too. The words hung in the air, soft and weightless, yet heavier than anything Rick had expected to feel. He wanted to brush them off, make a joke, but he didn't. Instead, he reached into his pocket and found the pebble Morty had given him the night they arrived. It was still warm, still holding a trace of Morty's hand. Rick turned it over slowly, feeling the edges, feeling the weight. Somehow, the simple act of holding it grounded him more than any invention ever had. He realized that some of the smallest things, a touch, a word, a presence, could carry more meaning than all the chaos of infinite universes. Morty wandered closer, watching him quietly. You okay, Rick? Rick nodded slowly, finally meeting the boy's gaze. Yeah, kid, I'm better than okay. Just thinking about noticing. Morty grinned, satisfied. Good, because I like noticing too. Makes me feel, important. Rick's chest tightened in a way he hadn't expected. Morty didn't just mean important in the usual sense. He meant alive, seen, needed. And Rick realized with a quiet awe that he had spent so long running from needing anyone that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be needed in return. They walked a little farther until they reached a small stream, clear and gentle, trickling over smooth stones. Morty knelt beside it, cupping his hands to drink. Rick watched him, noting the way the boy's hair caught the sunlight, how his small movements were precise yet unhurried, how alive he seemed in this quiet, soft world. You know, Rick, Morty said after a pause, I think we're kinda lucky. Most people never get a place like this, or a moment like this, or someone like each other. Rick felt a lump in his throat. Not fear, not anger, not laughter, but a kind of quiet reverence. He had never allowed himself to admit it, but Morty's presence had become something he couldn't ignore. A constant, a light, a calm. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to hold him steady when all else threatened to pull him apart. The sun began to dip low, spilling a soft golden light across the grove, and Morty lay back on the grass, humming softly to himself. Rick leaned against a tree, closing his eyes and listening. He didn't have to move, didn't have to fix, didn't have to plan. He only had to breathe and notice and be present. And in that quiet, he whispered to himself, almost a confession. Maybe we've been searching for this all along. The stream whispered nearby, the grass swayed with a gentle sigh, and the soft glow of the grove seemed to pulse with their presence. Rick let himself sink further into the calm, letting Morty's hum, the water, and the fading light wrap around him like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, he didn't need chaos, he didn't need adventure, he only needed to be here, now with Morty, noticing, breathing, existing. The world didn't demand anything else. And Rick finally allowed himself to trust that just for a while, that was enough. The light shifted slowly, softening the edges of the grove and painting everything in muted gold and green. Rick and Morty wandered along a winding path that seemed to fold gently into itself, a trail that invited their presence rather than demanding motion. Each step they took stirred the grass, sending whispers through the blades like quiet echoes of long-forgotten conversations. Morty paused and crouched by a patch of wildflowers, their petals shimmering faintly in the sun's warmth. He leaned close, tracing patterns with his fingers as though he were reading a story written in color and texture. "Rick, it's like the world wants us to see it," he whispered. Rick tilted his head, considering. "Maybe it does, kid, or maybe we just finally stopped rushing long enough to notice." He didn't make it a lesson. It was just a thought, soft and unsharpened, like the day itself. Morty smiled faintly and followed Rick's gaze along the path, letting his fingers brush the flowers lightly. "I like noticing," he said, simply. "Feels alive, even if nothing happens." Rick nodded slowly. There was a truth in that, a fragile, quiet truth that most universes would have erased with fire or chaos, and in this one he allowed it to exist, unhurried, unjudged. They walked further until a gentle stream appeared, winding lazily between mossy rocks and soft banks. The water was clear, almost impossibly still, reflecting the light and the shadows in equal measure. Morty knelt by the edge and cupped his hands, letting the cool liquid slide over his fingers. Rick watched him, noticing the boy's quiet attentiveness, the way he interacted with the world without fear or haste. "You know, Rick," Morty began, staring at the ripples in the water, I think we've been running for so long, all those adventures, all the crazy stuff. Maybe we forgot what it's like to just be." Rick felt the words settle inside him. He had been running, always running, through universes, through problems, through the chaos of existence, and Morty's observation wasn't a question, it wasn't a critique, it was simply true. For once, he didn't argue. "Maybe we did," he admitted softly. "But we're here now, and that counts." Morty leaned back on his hands, letting the light fall across his face. "Yeah, it does. It really does." They lingered by the stream, listening to the gentle rush of water over stone, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the faint hum of life that seemed to pulse quietly through the valley. Rick noticed how small things, a bird calling in the distance, a leaf drifting lazily downstream, could anchor a person if they let them. Morty had always noticed. Rick was learning, slowly, hesitantly. After a while, Morty stood and held out his hand. "Come on, Rick, let's keep going. I want to see what's up ahead." Rick took it, a small, reluctant smile tugging at his lips. They moved together through the valley, each step soft, careful, and full of observation. The landscape shifted subtly as they walked, the colors and shapes bending gently around them. Rick realized that the universe wasn't changing for them in dramatic ways. It was offering quiet opportunities, gentle gifts, moments to notice and feel. They reached a hill that overlooked the valley, where the grass swayed like water, and the sky stretched endlessly above. Morty sat down and gazed at the horizon, breathing in the calm. Rick stood behind him, leaning against a tree, observing the boy in silence. "You know, Rick," Morty said after a pause, I think I understand you better here. Not the scary, genius, wild side. I mean, the soft side, the part you don't usually show." Rick's chest tightened. He wasn't used to being seen like that. Not fully, not without sarcasm or distance. But Morty's presence carried no judgment. It simply acknowledged. It simply noticed. "You're learning a lot, kid," Rick muttered softly. "I didn't think I'd let anyone see that side." But maybe it's okay. Morty smiled, eyes half closed, the glow of the day reflecting softly in them. I like it, being here with you. Even when it's quiet, I feel safe, even if it's just a little. Rick's throat constricted, the words heavy and warm. He didn't have a clever response, didn't need one. He simply knelt beside Morty, letting the boy's small hand brush against his own, and allowed himself to feel the rare, gentle certainty of presence. The day deepened slowly into evening, the sun folding into the horizon like a soft sigh. The valley glowed faintly, every detail bathed in a gentle light that seemed to ask nothing of them. Rick and Morty remained on the hill, silent but connected, their breathing sinking softly to the rhythm of the world around them. Rick realized, for the first time in countless adventures, that the greatest journey wasn't through portals or galaxies. It was the journey inward, noticing, feeling, being present, and allowing someone else to notice and feel alongside you. Morty had grown quietly, steadily, like the river carving the valley, and Rick felt the small, steady change within himself in response. Thanks, kid, Rick whispered finally, almost afraid to break the calm. For noticing me too. Morty looked up, half smiling, and whispered back, Always, Rick. Always. The stars began to appear faintly, timid against the darkening sky, and the world seemed to wrap them in a soft, protective blanket. Rick leaned back, watching the first glimmers of night, letting the silence, the valley, and Morty's presence fill him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rick didn't need to run, he didn't need to fix, he didn't need to calculate or escape. He only needed to be. And so he was, quietly, gently, entirely, with the boy who had always been his anchor, his reminder, his small, unwavering light. Night began to settle over the valley like a soft blanket, pulling the edges of the day into gentle shadows. Rick and Morty walked slowly, letting their steps follow the curves of the land rather than forcing a path. The stars above shimmered faintly, reflecting a world that had forgotten urgency for a while. Morty's hand brushed against Rick's as they moved, almost by accident, and Rick felt the subtle grounding warmth of presence, steady and quiet. They arrived at a small pond, the surface smooth as glass, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a fish breaking through. Morty knelt at the edge, cupping water in his hands, and let it trickle slowly between his fingers. Rick, it's like time doesn't matter here, he said softly. Rick crouched beside him, watching the faint glow of the pond mirrored in Morty's eyes. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe here we get to just exist. No explosions, no running, no ticking clocks, just this. Morty smiled faintly, letting the water slip through his hands. I like it. Makes me feel safe, even if it's only for a little while. Rick felt the weight of the words pressed gently on him. Safety wasn't something he usually gave, and it wasn't something he often sought. But here, in this quiet universe, he realized it was possible. Morty's calmness, his small steadiness, had become something Rick hadn't expected, a kind of home. They sat by the pond, side by side, letting the silence stretch between them like a soft melody. Occasionally, a breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it scents of flowers and damp earth. Morty traced patterns on the moss beside him, humming softly, and Rick noticed how the boys' small acts of presence seemed to slow the world around them, as though it wanted to be noticed too. After a long pause, Morty spoke again. Rick, do you ever think about what it all means? All the things we've seen, all the places we've been? Rick didn't answer immediately. He usually had a quick, sharp remark ready for questions like that. But tonight he found himself silent, letting the thought unfold without interference. Maybe it's not about meaning, he said finally. Maybe it's about noticing, paying attention, being here for someone, and letting them be here for you. Morty's eyes lit up softly. Yeah, I think I get that. It's nice. Makes things feel warmer. Rick nodded slowly, a quiet acknowledgement. He leaned back, letting the cool grass press against his spine. Warmth. Yeah, that's a good word for it. They watched the pond in companionable silence, the water reflecting the first faint glimmers of stars. Morty hummed his quiet tune again, and Rick realized he was listening, not just hearing, but truly listening in a way he hadn't allowed himself in years. Every note, every ripple, every small movement became a soft anchor, tethering him to this gentle world. Eventually, Morty lay down, staring at the reflected sky. Rick, do you think we could stay here forever? Rick chuckled softly, shaking his head. Forever is a lot, kid. But yeah, for now we can stay, just like this, breathing, noticing. Being Morty's hand brushed against Rick's again, a small, unspoken comfort. Rick realized he didn't want to move, didn't want to leave. The boy's presence, simple and steady, had become something he depended on without admitting it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. They lay there for hours, watching as darkness deepened and the stars multiplied. The night was alive with soft sounds, the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant call of some unseen creature. Morty's breathing slowed, rhythmic and gentle, and Rick allowed himself to match it, feeling a rare and tender stillness settle over him. Rick thought about the adventures they had survived, the universes they had fled, and the chaos they had left behind. And for the first time, he realized that none of that mattered here. The explosions, the escapes, the inventions, they were all distant echoes. What mattered was this: presence, noticing, shared quiet, and the small, gentle ways they had come to care for each other. He whispered softly to Morty, almost afraid to break the delicate balance. Kid, you make this place better. Just being here, noticing, humbling me without trying. I appreciate it more than I can say. Morty turned slightly, smiling faintly. I appreciate you too, Rick. Not just for the adventures, but for being here. Even when you're grumpy or scary, you're still you. Rick felt something rare stir inside him, a quiet ache, tender and unthreatening. He had never expected gratitude or acknowledgement like this to mean so much, and yet here it was, as simple and grounding as the pond beside them. They remained there, watching the sky deepen into night, letting the stars and the soft chorus of the valley fill them. Morty's hum became a lullaby in the air, a gentle counterpoint to the slow pulse of the world. Rick let himself breathe it in, slowly, deliberately, feeling the tension of countless universes slip away, leaving only the calm, soft reality of this place and this boy. Eventually, Rick allowed his eyes to close, leaning back against the cool grass. He didn't need to calculate, to plan, or to invent. He only needed to exist here, quietly, gently, with Morty's presence beside him. And as the night deepened, the stars twinkling faintly above, Rick whispered softly to the universe and to himself, maybe. This is what it's always been about. Not the chaos, not the adventures. Just noticing, just being. Morty's soft hum continued, blending with the night, carrying them both into a gentle, reflective peace. The world didn't demand anything more, and for the first time, Rick was okay with that. Dawn crept quietly over the valley, brushing the hills with pale, gentle light that made everything shimmer softly. Rick and Morty were awake early, though neither moved in haste. The air smelled of dew and faintly of earth, a calm perfume that made the world feel as if it were breathing alongside them. Morty stretched lazily, his hair catching the morning light, and Rick watched him with a quiet awareness he hadn't thought possible. "You ever notice," Morty said, tracing patterns in the soft grass with his fingers, "how quiet the mornings are here? Like, even the birds whisper instead of chirp." Rick nodded slowly, letting the observation sink in. "Yeah, kid, it's different. No alarms, no chaos, just soft moments. Makes you notice things you usually miss." Morty hummed softly as if in agreement, his small melody drifting lightly on the breeze. Rick realized that it wasn't just the morning that was quiet. It was the space between them, the pauses, the gestures, the subtle ways they had grown accustomed to one another. He had never considered how much he could notice in silence until now. They wandered toward a hill that overlooked the valley, the grass brushing their ankles as if greeting them. Morty stopped suddenly and bent to examine a small cluster of wildflowers, petals trembling lightly in the morning air. "Rick, these are delicate. Really delicate." Rick crouched beside him, studying the flowers. They were fragile, almost luminescent in the soft light, bending under the gentlest touch. He realized he could see the world differently here, noticing strength and beauty in fragility itself. "Yeah, delicate, but still standing. Kind of like us, huh?" Morty smiled faintly. "I guess. Yeah, we're standing too, even if it's been hard." Rick felt the words press against him, a quiet warmth that lingered longer than any explosion or adventure ever could. He didn't answer immediately, simply letting the moment stretch, letting Morty's presence ground him in a gentle way. The boy leaned back on the grass, letting his fingers trail through the soft strands. Rick joined him, not touching, just existing alongside, feeling the quiet rhythm of the valley settle over them. "You know," Morty said after a pause, "sometimes I think the universe gives us these little spaces so we can remember who we really are." Rick considered that, feeling the truth in it. They had survived countless universes, faced dangers, and witnessed chaos beyond comprehension. Yet it was here, in quiet reflection, in soft observation, in shared presence, that he felt most alive. "Maybe you're right, kid. Maybe these spaces are reminders." Morty hummed again, the tune slow and tender, winding through the valley like a gentle river. Rick listened, letting the sound soak into him, feel it in his chest, and realize that he hadn't allowed himself to listen so deeply in years. The world had always demanded speed, attention, control. But here, he could let it go. He could simply be. They rose slowly and wandered toward a nearby grove where the trees arched in soft, protective curves. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering gentle patterns across the ground. Morty ran his hands along the tree trunks, smiling faintly as he traced the rough bark. "I like it here," he whispered. "I feel safe, like nothing can rush me." Rick watched him, realizing that safety wasn't something he usually offered, and it wasn't something he often felt. Yet in this place, with Morty beside him, he sensed a fragile, enduring calm he could depend on, if only for now. They found a small clearing and settled there, the moss soft beneath them. Morty closed his eyes and hummed, letting the day's gentle warmth wash over him. Rick leaned against a tree trunk nearby, eyes half closed, feeling the steady rhythm of the boy's breathing and the soft pulse of the grove around them. "You know, Rick," Morty said quietly, "I think I understand a little better why you're like,
You, not the genius or the wild side, but the quiet, noticing side, the part that really sees. Rick felt a rare ache of tenderness. The boy's words weren't probing or demanding, they were simply acknowledging. A mirror held gently up to the part of Rick he had long ignored. Yeah, kid, I'm glad you notice. Not many do. Morty smiled faintly, eyes closed, humming softly. I do, and I like noticing. Makes me feel connected, makes me feel like I matter. Rick's chest tightened. He realized with quiet astonishment that Morty's presence had anchored him in ways he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It wasn't about adventure, science, or chaos. It was about noticing, being noticed, and the small, tender ways they cared for each other. The day stretched lazily into afternoon, sunlight filtering in golden beams that warmed the valley. Morty wandered closer to a small stream, letting the water slip through his fingers and listening to the soft gurgle. Rick followed, feeling a rare sense of patience and calm. He didn't need to explain, to calculate, or to fix anything. He simply existed alongside, noticing, breathing, feeling. Morty turned to him, a faint smile on his face. Rick, I think I like this. I like being here with you, even when it's quiet, even when nothing happens. Rick nodded slowly, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, kid, me too. This counts, maybe more than anything else we've done. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of soft orange and purple. The stars emerged faintly, tentative against the deepening twilight. Rick leaned back on the moss, letting the soft hum of the world carry him. Morty lay nearby, still humming, his small presence steady and grounding. Rick closed his eyes, letting the quiet and the gentle warmth of shared presence fill him completely. He didn't need explosions, he didn't need chaos, he didn't need to solve anything, he only needed to exist here, now, with Morty, noticing and being noticed. And as the first stars twinkled above the valley, he whispered softly to the universe and to himself. Maybe this is what matters. Not the chaos, not the running, just noticing, just being. Morty's hum continued, blending with the soft whisper of the grove, carrying them both into a reflective, tender peace. And for once, the world asked nothing more. The valley awoke slowly, wrapped in the soft glow of dawn that spilled over the hills like a whispered secret. Rick and Morty moved through the morning with deliberate ease, letting each step follow the natural contours of the land. The dew clung to the grass, sparkling faintly, and the air smelled of damp earth and distant blossoms, carrying a gentle sense of presence that seemed to ask only that they notice. Morty paused near a cluster of stones, running his fingers over their smooth, worn surfaces. Rick, it's funny, he said softly, how some
things feel older than everything else, like they've been waiting for someone to see them. Rick crouched beside him, feeling the weight of the stones beneath his fingertips. Yeah, kid, some things, they just exist, waiting, not in a rush, not demanding attention, just being. Kind of like us, I guess. Morty smiled faintly, letting the small comment settle between them. I like noticing that, makes me feel part of it, even when it's quiet. They wandered further, guided by the gentle hum of the valley and the subtle sway of the grass. Birds called softly in the distance, not loud enough to startle, just enough to remind them of the life all around. Rick noticed the way Morty's eyes followed every movement, the way his hands brushed over leaves and stones, the way his presence seemed to ripple through the quiet world. You know, Rick, Morty said after a pause, I think I like mornings here the most. Everything's calm and I can just notice, not rush, not worry, just see things as they are. Rick nodded, feeling the quiet truth of it resonate within him. He had spent so much of his life in motion, in chaos, in constant invention, that he had almost forgotten how to notice, how to pause, how to simply exist alongside someone else without trying to fix, change, or control. They reached a shallow stream that curved gently through the valley, its waters clear and steady. Morty knelt beside it, cupping his hands and letting the water trickle through his fingers. "It's soft," he murmured. "Even the water feels gentle here." Rick leaned back against a tree, closing his eyes for a moment. "Yeah, it is. Soft where calm, steady, feels alive in a way that doesn't scream at you." Morty hummed lightly, a melody that rose and fell like the wind itself. Rick listened, feeling each note as if it were a small tether to this quiet, deliberate world. The hum carried warmth, patience, and understanding, and he realized he had been carrying so much noise inside him that he had almost forgotten what gentle felt like. After a while, Morty stood and reached for Rick's hand. "Come on, I think we should see what's up the hill." Rick took it, surprised by the boy's steady confidence, by the quiet assurance of presence. They walked together, letting the earth guide them, letting the soft sway of the grass and the gentle slope of the hill determine their pace. For once, Rick didn't feel the urge to rush ahead, to plan, to calculate. He simply followed, noticing the subtle changes in light and sound, feeling the small, steady pulse of the world around him. At the top of the hill, the valley stretched out below, a patchwork of green, gold, and shadow. The sun had climbed higher, spilling warmth over everything and making the landscape glow as if remembering old stories. Morty lay down on the soft grass, letting the light fall across his face, and Rick sat beside him, leaning against a tree trunk. "You know, Rick," Morty said after a long pause, "I think this is the first time I've ever really felt part of something bigger. Even if it's just a valley, or a morning, or a song in the wind. I feel, connected." Rick nodded slowly, feeling the quiet ache of truth in those words. Connection had been a foreign concept for so long, something he had brushed aside in favor of logic, escape, and invention. But Morty had shown him a different kind of bond, one built on noticing, on being present, on sharing quiet spaces without expectation. "You're learning a lot, kid," Rick murmured. "Not the usual stuff. Not about science or escape. About noticing, about being, about us." Morty smiled faintly, humming softly again, letting the melody blend with the valley's natural rhythm. "I think I understand more than I did before, about you, about me, about everything in between." Rick felt a rare warmth spread through him, subtle and steady. He realized that the boy's presence had become something he didn't want to take for granted. Morty's quiet attention, his small acts of noticing, had anchored Rick in a way that no invention, no portal, no universe-altering escape ever could. As the afternoon settled into soft gold and shadow, Rick and Morty remained on the hill, side by side, letting the quiet stretch over them. The wind stirred lightly, carrying the faint scent of flowers and earth. Birds sang softly, and the stream below whispered gently. Everything was alive, but in a calm, deliberate way that invited reflection, observation, and presence. Rick realized that adventure didn't have to be loud, dangerous, or chaotic. Adventure could be still. Adventure could be soft. Adventure could be simply noticing the small, delicate, luminous things in the world and appreciating the presence of someone who notices with you. Morty rolled onto his back, staring at the sky, humming his gentle tune. Rick leaned back against the tree, closing his eyes, letting the valley fold around him like a protective embrace. He didn't need to move, didn't need to invent, didn't need to calculate. He only needed to exist here, in this moment, alongside the boy who had taught him how to notice again. And as the first stars of evening began to shimmer faintly above the horizon, Rick whispered softly, almost to himself, "Maybe. This is the true adventure, not the chaos, not the running, just noticing, just being." Morty's soft hum continued, threading through the gentle evening, carrying them both into a calm, reflective peace. The world demanded nothing more, and for the first time Rick felt fully content to simply exist, to simply notice, to simply be. The morning unfolded like a soft sigh, the light spilling gently over the valley and brushing everything with a quiet warmth. Rick and Morty moved slowly, allowing the contours of the land to guide their steps, letting the subtle shifts of shadow and color draw their attention. Even the air felt alive here, carrying hints of dew and distant flowers, wrapping around them like a gentle, invisible embrace. Morty paused by a slender tree, brushing his fingers along the smooth bark. "Rick, I think some trees feel like they're listening, like they remember all the little things we never say out loud." Rick crouched beside him, feeling the cool, firm trunk beneath his hands. "Maybe they do, kid. Maybe everything here remembers, even the things we don't notice ourselves." Morty smiled faintly, tracing a small pattern in the moss at the base of the tree. "I like noticing that. Makes me feel part of it all, even when no one's watching." Rick nodded slowly, letting the words settle like a soft weight in his chest. It wasn't just the boy who was noticing, it was the world itself, waiting to be observed, appreciated, and understood in quiet ways. He had spent so long moving, calculating, running, almost forgetting how it felt to pause, to witness, to simply be. They continued their walk, the soft murmur of a stream guiding them like a gentle melody. The water slipped over rocks, smooth and unhurried, creating ripples that seemed to dance in quiet celebration. Morty knelt beside it, cupping water in his hands and letting it trickle slowly back into the stream. "It's soft," he murmured. "Even the water feels gentle here." Rick leaned back against a nearby tree, closing his eyes and listening. "Soft, calm, alive. Yeah, kid, it's different here. No chaos, no alarms, just presence." Morty hummed softly, a tune that floated through the air like a whisper. Rick noticed how the boy's quiet melodies seemed to anchor him, slow the racing thoughts and ground him in the moment. He realized with a quiet awe that these small, tender acts, humming, noticing, simply being, carried more weight than any adventure, any invention, any escape from reality. After a while, Morty stood and extended his hand. "Come on, Rick, let's see what's up the hill." Rick took it, feeling the warmth of the boy's hand and the steady pulse of his presence. Together they moved, letting the path guide them naturally, letting the sway of the grass and the soft hum of the valley dictate their pace. For once, Rick didn't feel the need to lead, to calculate, to push ahead. He only followed, noticing the small changes of light, the gentle movements of life, the quiet pulse of existence. At the top of the hill, the valley stretched beneath them in a patchwork of green, gold, and shadow. Sunlight spilled across everything, making it glow softly, revealing textures and details that often went unnoticed. Morty lay down in the grass, eyes half closed, soaking in the gentle warmth. Rick leaned back against a tree trunk, feeling the subtle heartbeat of the valley beneath him. "You know, Rick," Morty said after a long pause, "I think I'm starting to understand why we're
here, not just in this valley, but here together. It's not about the adventures, the chaos, or even surviving. It's about noticing and being noticed." Rick let the words settle. He had spent so long trying to shield himself, to hide behind intellect, sarcasm, and unpredictability. But Morty's presence had shown him another way, one of trust, of gentle awareness, of shared stillness. "Yeah, kid, I think you're right. Being noticed, noticing, it matters more than any adventure we've ever been on." Morty hummed again, letting the melody blend with the soft sigh of the valley. "I like noticing you, Rick. Even the quiet, weird parts, the ones no one else sees." Rick felt a rare warmth settle in his chest, subtle and grounding. Morty's words weren't just comforting, they anchored him. He realized that he had been searching for connection in chaos, in motion, in brilliance, but the strongest bond he had was here, quiet, consistent, gentle. The day deepened, sunlight softening into a warm glow that illuminated every leaf, every blade of grass, every ripple in the stream. Rick and Morty remained on the hill, side by side, breathing in the calm, letting the subtle rhythm of the world around them fold into their presence. Rick reflected on everything they had survived: explosions, interdimensional escapes, and countless universes. And yet none of that mattered here. The true adventure, he realized, wasn't found in danger or invention. It was found in the quiet moments, the noticing, the shared presence, the gentle acts of care, the understanding without words. Morty rolled onto his back, humming softly, eyes fixed on the sky that was slowly shifting from gold to soft purple. Rick leaned back beside him, feeling the calm pulse of the valley beneath them and letting himself fully exist without expectation, calculation, or planning. "You know, Rick," Morty whispered after a pause, "I think this is how I want to remember the world. Not as chaos, not as danger, but soft, quiet, full of little things worth noticing, and full of people worth caring for." Rick nodded slowly, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, kid, me too. This counts more than anything else, maybe more than all the universes we've visited." The first stars began to glimmer faintly above the horizon, timid against the fading light. Rick closed his eyes, letting the calm, warmth, and steady presence of Morty carry him. He didn't need explosions, portals, or genius inventions. He only needed to notice to exist and to be noticed. And as the soft twilight stretched over the valley, Rick whispered quietly to himself and the universe, "Maybe this is what truly matters. Not the chaos, not the running, just noticing, just being." Morty's hum carried on gently, blending with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of unseen creatures. And for the first time in a long while, Rick allowed himself to simply
exist, to simply notice, to simply be, and to appreciate the quiet, tender presence of someone who mattered more than he could say. The valley wore a gentle hush, as if it had been waiting for them to notice its quiet presence. Rick and Morty moved slowly through the morning mist, the soft dew brushing against their shoes and the occasional leaf. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and blooming flowers, carrying a delicate sweetness that seemed to seep into their thoughts and ease them. Morty's hand brushed against a tall blade of grass, letting it sway lazily before continuing. "Rick," Morty began softly, glancing up at the canopy of trees that arched overhead, "do you ever feel like the world has stories it never tells? Like It keeps them just for those who notice. Rick crouched beside him, letting his fingers touch the cool, damp moss at the base of a tree. Yeah, kid, I think that's true. Some stories aren't written in words. They're in the way the wind moves, the way the sun touches the ground, the way someone hums a tune without even thinking. Morty smiled faintly, letting the thought sink in. I like that. Makes everything feel alive, even when it's quiet, even when it's small. Rick nodded, feeling the truth of the boy's observation. He had spent so much of his life in motion, in loud, chaotic adventures, that he had almost forgotten the weight and wonder of quiet presence. And here, in this gentle valley, everything seemed to slow down, to bloom softly, to invite attention and reflection. They wandered toward a shallow stream, the water glimmering with faint light that seemed to come from somewhere between the stones and the sky. Morty knelt beside it, cupping water in his hands and letting it slip slowly through his fingers. It's like the water knows not to rush. Even when it flows, it's calm. I like that. Rick leaned back against a nearby tree, letting the soft rustle of leaves fill the space between their words. Yeah, soft, steady, gentle. That's the stuff people usually overlook. But it's what lasts, kid. It's what matters. Morty hummed, a quiet melody that seemed to echo the pulse of the valley. Rick noticed how the boy's small hum carried warmth and steadiness, anchoring him in ways he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Each note, each soft vibration, grounded Rick in the present, letting the chaos of countless adventures fade into something tender and calm. They continued walking, letting the soft sway of the grass guide their path. Morty occasionally paused to touch flowers, stones, or leaves, his fingers tracing their shapes gently. Rick observed silently, realizing that these small acts of noticing were teaching him patience, presence, and the subtle art of simply being. "You know, Rick," Morty said after a pause, "I think I understand you better when it's quiet. Not the wild genius side or the scary stuff, but the part that
really sees, notices, cares." Rick's chest tightened slightly. The boy's words were simple, unassuming, but they carried a weight he hadn't expected. He realized that Morty's quiet attention and presence had become a kind of anchor, a gentle reminder that connection didn't need explosions or genius inventions. It could simply exist quietly, patiently, fully. They reached a small hill that overlooked the valley, and Morty lay down in the soft grass, letting the light spill over him like a gentle wave. Rick leaned back against a tree, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of sunlight, the whisper of leaves, and the steady presence of the boy beside him seep into every part of his being. "You know, Rick," Morty murmured, eyes half closed, "I think the quiet moments teach us more than any adventure, more than any universe we've escaped or conquered. They show us what matters, who matters." Rick nodded slowly, letting the words settle. He had spent so long chasing the extraordinary that he had almost forgotten the subtle power of ordinary presence, the soft strength in noticing and being noticed, the quiet courage of simply caring. "Yeah, kid, that's true. It's the soft stuff that counts most, the small, steady things we don't always see." Morty hummed again, his soft tune drifting through the valley like a gentle wind. Rick listened, letting the hum sink into him, into his chest, into the slow rhythm of his breath. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to exist fully without urgency, without invention, without calculation. He only needed to be here, now alongside the boy who had shown him the quiet strength of noticing. The sun shifted toward the horizon, painting the valley in soft gold and amber light. Rick and Morty remained on the hill side by side, letting the warmth and calm stretch over them. Each small detail, the sway of grass, the glint of water, the rustle of leaves, carried more weight than any adventure, more depth than any chaotic escape. Rick realized that he didn't need to be extraordinary in loud ways anymore. Being present, noticing, and sharing quiet moments with someone who mattered was enough. The soft world around them and the small, steady hum of Morty's presence anchored him in a way he hadn't thought possible. Morty turned slightly, smiling faintly, eyes reflecting the warm glow of the day. Rick, I think I like noticing everything. You, the valley, even the little things. It makes me feel alive. Rick let a rare smile touch his lips. I know, kid. Me too. More than I can say. The first stars began to appear faintly, shimmering against the softening sky. Rick closed his eyes, breathing slowly, letting the gentle pulse of the world fill him completely. He didn't need chaos, calculation, or adventure. He only needed presence, noticing, and the quiet, steady bond they shared. And as the night settled gently over the valley, Rick
whispered softly, almost to himself, maybe this is what matters most. Not the chaos, not the running, not the universes, just noticing, just being. Morty's soft hum continued, threading through the air like a lullaby for the valley. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Rick allowed himself to simply exist, to simply notice, and to simply be, fully present, fully calm, fully anchored. The morning light seeped through the trees with a tender patience, spilling warmth across the valley in slow, deliberate rays. Rick and Morty moved carefully along a winding path, letting the subtle twists and turns of the terrain set the rhythm of their steps. Every blade of grass, every droplet of dew, every gentle breeze felt amplified in the soft stillness around them. Morty ran his fingers across the bark of a tree, feeling its quiet heartbeat. "Rick," Morty whispered, "do you ever feel like the world is alive in ways we don't always see? Like it's breathing with us, waiting for us to notice it?" Rick paused, letting the question linger in the cool air. He hadn't expected the boy to ask such a gentle, introspective question, and yet it felt fitting in this quiet place. "Yeah, kid, sometimes I think it's all alive, not in the loud, obvious ways we're used to, but quietly, patiently, like it's inviting us to pay attention." Morty smiled faintly, letting the thought settle. "I like that. Makes me feel part of something bigger, even when nothing's happening, even when it's just quiet." Rick nodded, feeling the weight of Morty's words. He had spent so many years in noise, chaos, and constant motion that he had almost forgotten the delicate pulse of presence. And here, in this valley, each pause and every gentle movement seemed to demand attention, to remind him of the subtle beauty in noticing. They wandered toward a brook that meandered softly through the landscape, its waters glinting with the morning light. Morty knelt beside it, cupping water in his hands and letting it trickle slowly back into the stream. "It feels safe here," he murmured. "Even the water seems gentle. Even the stones seem patient." Rick leaned back against a nearby tree, eyes half closed, letting the sounds of the valley wrap around him. "Yeah, safe, software steady. That's the kind of strength people usually overlook. But it's the kind that lasts, kid. The kind that matters." Morty hummed a soft, slow tune, letting it blend naturally with the rustling leaves and distant birdsong. Rick realized how much the boy's quiet hum anchored him, slowed the rush of thoughts, and brought his attention fully into the present. It wasn't flashy or heroic, but it was grounding, almost sacred in its simplicity. After a while, Morty stood, brushing off his hands. "Come on, Rick, I want to see the top of that hill over there. I think it'll show us something." Rick took the boy's hand and followed, feeling the warmth of the small gesture and the steadiness in Morty's grip. Together they walked slowly, letting the land and the valley guide them naturally. The swaying grass, the gentle curves of the hills, and the soft murmur of the brook all seemed to synchronize with their movement. Rick noticed the subtle play of sunlight on leaves, the occasional ripple in the water, the tiny details that had always escaped him. At the top of the hill, the valley spread below like a quiet painting, patches of gold, green, and shadow melding seamlessly. Morty lay down in the soft grass, letting his fingers trace the contours of the earth. Rick leaned against a tree, watching the gentle shimmer of the landscape and the faint glimmer of the stream winding below. "You know, Rick," Morty said after a long pause, eyes focused on the sky, "I think I'm learning that the quiet moments teach us more than the loud ones. They show us who we really care about, who really matters." Rick felt a rare ache of tenderness, subtle and steady. He had spent so long seeking significance in chaos, in genius, in escape, that he had almost forgotten the power of quiet attention, of soft presence, of the deep strength in noticing. "Yeah, kid, that's true. The small, quiet things often carry more weight than any spectacle we've ever chased." Morty hummed again, letting the melody drift through the valley like a soft wind. Rick listened, feeling each note resonate inside him, calming the tension that had become second nature over countless adventures. He realized that the greatest discoveries were not in explosions or interdimensional escapes, but in the simple, shared awareness of another presence, someone who cared and noticed without demanding, without rushing. The sun shifted slowly, casting gentle shadows across the hills. Rick and Morty remained on the hilltop, side by side, letting the warmth of the day and the calm of the valley fold around them. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every subtle movement of water beneath them seemed alive, waiting to be observed, appreciated, and remembered. Rick reflected on all the universes they had visited, the dangers they had faced, and the chaos they had endured. None of it mattered here. The true richness, the true adventure, was in these small, deliberate moments of noticing and being noticed, in the steady, quiet bond that had grown between them. Morty turned his head slightly, eyes reflecting the soft, golden light. "Rick, I think I like noticing everything. You, the valley, even the smallest stones and streams. It makes me feel alive, connected, safe." Rick let a small, rare smile touch his lips. "Me too, kid, more than I can say. This is enough, more than enough." The first stars began to appear faintly above the horizon, twinkling gently as if recognizing the quiet significance of the moment. Rick closed his eyes, breathing in the calm, letting Morty's presence and the tender rhythm of the valley carry him. He didn't need loud adventures or clever inventions. He only needed this: the shared stillness, the noticing, the quiet understanding that they mattered to each other. And as the night slowly draped itself over the valley, Rick whispered softly, almost to himself, "Maybe this is the adventure that really matters. Not the chaos, not the running, not the universes, just noticing, just being." Morty's soft hum lingered, threading through the quiet of the valley like a lullaby. For the first time in years, Rick allowed himself to simply exist, to simply notice, and to simply be, fully anchored in a gentle, reflective peace that he had never thought possible. The valley had surrendered to night, a soft hush draped across the hills, as if the earth itself wished to rest. Rick and Morty sat close to a small fire that crackled gently, its flames swaying like slow dancers beneath the stars. The world around them seemed infinite and intimate at the same time, each star a window to vast distances, each flame a reminder of the here and now. Morty leaned forward, poking at the fire with a thin branch, watching the sparks leap briefly into the air before dissolving back into the dark. "Rick," he whispered, "do you ever wonder if the stars are watching us too, like we're looking at them, but maybe they're looking back?" Rick tilted his head back, his gaze steady on the endless canvas above. He had seen galaxies burn, stars collapse, and universes expand beyond reason. But in Morty's voice, the question carried no calculation, only curiosity, only wonder. "Maybe they are, kid," Rick said quietly. "Or maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're noticing them. That's enough. That's what makes them alive for us." Morty's eyes softened as he looked back at the stars, his chest rising and falling with an almost sleepy rhythm. The boy wasn't seeking answers, he was seeking connection. Rick could feel it. The firelight painted their faces in gold and shadow. The crackling blended with the rustle of leaves, the faraway song of night creatures, and the steady rhythm of the brook still flowing beyond the hill. The world felt whole, undivided. Morty placed the branch aside and lay back on the grass, arms folded beneath his head, his eyes tracing constellations only he could imagine. "It's kind of crazy, Rick. We've been to so many places, seen so many things, and yet this is the first time I feel like I'm really part of something, like the stars are part of me, like you're part of me." Rick exhaled slowly, the words catching him off guard. He had long armored himself with cynicism, sarcasm, and escape. Yet Morty's honesty pierced through that armor with disarming ease. He sat down beside him, stretching out his legs, feeling the grass bend gently under his weight. "I get it, Morty," Rick murmured. "For all the running around."
We do, for all the noise and chaos. Sometimes it takes quiet to see what's real, what lasts. And right now, this is real. The stars deepened overhead, more and more of them revealing themselves as if unveiling secrets in silence. Morty reached out his hand toward the sky, fingers spread as though he could cradle a constellation between them. "Do you think we're small, Rick? Like really small, just specks?" Rick turned his head, studying Morty's expression, half in awe, half in uncertainty. "Yeah, kid, we're small, but that doesn't mean we're nothing. Sometimes being small means we fit better into the big picture. Sometimes the quietest notes in a song are the ones that hold it together." Morty smiled faintly, lowering his hand, letting it rest on the grass beside Rick's. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, full of the fire's warmth, the stars' gentle glow, the rustle of leaves, and the steady companionship that had grown unspoken between them. Hours passed softly, the fire shrinking to glowing embers. Morty's eyes fluttered shut, but his breathing carried the rhythm of someone still listening, still connected. Rick remained awake, staring at the constellations with a mind uncharacteristically still. For once he didn't feel the itch to build, to destroy, to solve. He only felt the weight of presence, his own and the boy's beside him. When Morty stirred slightly in his sleep, Rick gently placed a blanket over him, careful not to disturb the peace etched into the boy's face. The blanket wasn't just warmth, it was quiet acknowledgement. Rick rarely admitted it, but in this moment, Morty wasn't just his grandson, wasn't just a tag along to chaotic adventures. He was his anchor, the reminder of why noticing mattered, why staying mattered. The night pressed deeper, and the sky shimmered with impossible beauty. For the first time in longer than he could recall, Rick whispered words that were not laced with irony or bitterness. "You matter, Morty, more than any of it. More than all the universes I've wasted myself chasing." The boy shifted faintly, a soft smile appearing even in his sleep, as if he had heard and accepted the words without needing to wake. Rick let his own eyes close, leaning back against the earth that cradled them both, letting the stars keep their watch. When dawn finally began its slow approach, the first brush of pale light stretched across the horizon, softening the dark into shades of blue. Birds stirred with tentative calls, and the valley seemed to inhale deeply, waking from its own dream. Morty blinked awake, yawning softly, his hair tousled from the night. He looked at Rick, who was already awake, watching the sunrise with an unreadable expression. "Rick, did you stay up all night?" Rick smirked faintly, though his eyes held no weariness. "Yeah, kid, guess I didn't want to miss any of it." Morty rubbed his eyes, then smiled,
understanding without needing explanation. "It was worth it, though, right?" Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, worth it." The sun rose, spilling gold across the valley, igniting the brook with firelight and painting the hills in brilliance. Rick and Morty sat together, neither needing to speak much more. They had carried the silence through the night, and now the morning seemed to carry them. The world stretched vast before them, but in that moment their universe was simple. A hill, a sunrise, a bond quietly stronger than either of them had dared to name. And for the first time in many journeys, Rick allowed himself to believe that perhaps he didn't need to escape. Perhaps everything he needed was already here, in the stars, in the silence, and in the boy who had reminded him how to notice. The sun had climbed high, painting the sky in strokes of pale gold and soft azure. The air carried the fragrance of dew drying on grass, of earth warmed gently after a long night of rest. Rick and Morty had descended from the hill, their steps quiet, almost hesitant, as though leaving behind the silence of the stars meant breaking some fragile spell. The valley opened wide before them, a patchwork of meadows and scattered trees, each leaf trembling lightly in the morning breeze. Birds rose in bursts of color, arcs of wings catching the light like sparks of life against the boundless sky. Morty watched them, his face brightening, though his eyes carried a kind of awe too heavy for words. "Rick," he said softly, "do you think the birds know where they're going? Or do they just fly until the wind takes them?" Rick adjusted the strap of his satchel, his gaze lingering not on the birds, but on the horizon beyond the valley. "Maybe a bit of both. Maybe they don't need to know every detail. Maybe the flying's enough." Morty let the thought settle inside him like a pebble dropped into still water, its ripples spreading quietly through his mind. He wanted to believe it. He wanted to believe that simply being in motion, simply noticing the world as it unfolded, was enough. They walked for hours, their path winding through soft grass and shaded groves where streams curled like silver ribbons. At times, Morty asked questions about the trees, about the shape of the clouds, about the way the brook never seemed to run dry. And Rick, though often curt in other moments of life, answered here with patience, his words soft, carrying no edge. As the sun began its slow descent toward afternoon, they reached the edge of the valley where cliffs rose high, their faces rugged and weather-worn, as if carved by the hand of time itself. The cliffs framed a vast lake, its surface shimmering like glass, reflecting the sky so perfectly that Morty felt he could step into it and fall upward into another world. They sat near the shore, where the gentle lapping of waves created a rhythm like a heartbeat. Morty crouched, trailing his fingers through the cool water, watching the ripples expand outward until they dissolved back into stillness. "It feels like the lake remembers everything," he murmured, "like every ripple that's ever been made. Stays here somehow." Rick lowered himself onto a smooth stone, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You're not wrong, Morty. Water keeps memories better than most things. It holds on to what passes through it. The difference is, it doesn't cling. It just keeps flowing." Morty nodded slowly, his reflection shimmering back at him. He looked older in the water somehow, though the same uncertainty lingered in his eyes. "Do you ever wish you could let go like that? Just keep flowing?" Rick stared at the horizon where the water kissed the sky. The question dug deeper than Morty perhaps intended. "Every day, Morty," he said quietly. "Every damn day, but letting go isn't easy when you've built walls out of the things you can't forget." The boy turned toward him, studying his face. Rick's eyes looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much for too long. And yet, there was something softer now, too. The tiniest crack in the walls he mentioned, a faint glow of light seeping through. The afternoon stretched on, golden light spilling across the lake. They spoke less, letting the silence carry them, until Morty lay back on the grass, his hands folded beneath his head, gazing up at drifting clouds. Rick remained sitting, his mind wandering through spaces both near and impossibly far. Then as the sun dipped lower, painting the lake in fire and shadow, Morty asked in a voice almost swallowed by the wind, "Rick, what happens when the story ends, like ours? When there's no more walking, no more stars, no more mornings like this? What happens then?" Rick's jaw tightened slightly. Of all the infinite questions he had faced across galaxies, this was the one that always cut the deepest. He turned to Morty, his eyes glinting with the reflection of the dying light. "The story never really ends, Morty. Not if someone remembers it, not if someone carries it with them. We'll end, sure, everything does, but the story, that keeps going. It lingers in the air, in the water, in the stars you keep staring at." Morty's throat tightened as he absorbed the words. The thought didn't feel sad, not exactly. It felt eternal, like a quiet promise that nothing was ever truly lost. The sky shifted into dusk, the lake catching every shade of twilight, lavender, rose, and deepening blue. The first stars blinked awake, cautious at first, then bolder as the night unfurled once more. Morty watched their reappearance with a soft smile, as though greeting old friends. Rick finally lay back beside him, the two of them staring upward together, the fire of sunset fading into the cool breath of night. "You notice, Morty," Rick whispered. "That's what keeps the story alive. Don't stop noticing." Morty turned his head, his eyes heavy but warm. "I won't, Rick." I promise. The promise hung between them as the stars deepened, the lake holding their reflections like a secret it would never betray. Crickets began their nightly chorus, and the world seemed to settle once again into its rhythm of rest. As Morty drifted toward sleep, Rick remained still, listening to the gentle lap of the water, the slow breathing of the boy beside him, and the eternal hush of the stars above. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt not like a wanderer without end, but like a man who had finally found a place. If not in the world, then at least in the presence of the boy who believed in him. And as the night took them, the lake shimmered quietly, keeping the memory of this chapter safe, as though it too understood that the story must go on. The night stretched long, but when dawn finally stirred, it came gently, like a whisper rather than a call. Pale light slipped across the horizon, brushing the tops of the cliffs with gold and softening the edges of the lake until it seemed less like water and more like sky given form. Rick stirred first, his eyes opening to the faint shimmer of morning dew clinging to blades of grass. Beside him, Morty slept on, his breath even, his face caught between the innocence of youth and the quiet weight of all he had come to understand. Rick sat up slowly, joints stiff from the earth beneath him. For a moment he just watched the boy sleep, the fragile rise and fall of his chest, the faint flicker of dreams playing across his expression. It had been years, decades even, since Rick had allowed himself to feel that particular pang of tenderness, the one that reminded him that despite all his cynicism, despite the walls he had built, he could still care deeply, recklessly, and without defense. The lake was still, holding the reflection of the dawn like a mirror too delicate to shatter. Rick bent forward, cupping water in his hands, letting it run through his fingers. It was cold and fleeting, yet its touch grounded him in the present moment, in a way all the universes he had drifted through never could. When Morty finally stirred, rubbing sleep from his eyes, the day was already unfurling. He sat up, squinting against the light, then smiled faintly at Rick, who stood silhouetted against the water. "You been up a while, huh?" "Couldn't sleep," Rick answered, his voice soft but lacking its usual weariness. "Sometimes the world's too quiet, and it makes the noise in your head louder." Morty nodded as though he understood, even if he couldn't feel the full depth of the words. He stood, brushing grass from his shirt, and joined Rick at the water's edge. The surface rippled at his touch as he knelt to drink, the coolness cutting through the fog of sleep. "It feels different here," he said quietly. "Like the world trusts us, like it wants us to stay." Rick glanced at him, the corner of his mouth twitching in the ghost of a smile. "Places don't trust, Morty. People do, but I get what you mean. There's something about it. Feels like it's been waiting a long time." They lingered by the shore a while longer, eating quietly from their meager supplies, watching the birds cut arcs across the rising light. Then, with packs slung once more across their shoulders, they began to climb the trail that wound away from the lake and into the shadow of the cliffs. The path was narrow, edged with wildflowers that swayed with each passing breeze. Their colors, violet, gold, pale blue, were muted in the early sun, as though still waking themselves. Morty brushed his hand against them as he walked, smiling faintly at the softness, the way each petal seemed to lean into his touch before springing back upright. Rick walked ahead, steady and sure-footed, though his gaze shifted often to the horizon, to the changing light, to the faint shapes that seemed to form in the distance, only to dissolve again into haze. He carried himself like a man searching for something he couldn't name, yet unwilling to admit he was searching at all. By midday they reached a plateau that opened wide, revealing the valley they had crossed the day before. From this height it seemed endless, a quilt of green and shadow stitched together by winding rivers. Morty stood in awe, his breath catching. "It's so big," he whispered, "like it could go on forever." Rick shaded his eyes with one hand, his expression unreadable. "Nothing goes on forever, Morty, but some things stretch long enough to make you think they do." They sat beneath the cliffs to rest, the sun warm on their shoulders, the wind carrying scents of pine and stone. Morty leaned back against the earth, closing his eyes, listening to the hum of insects and the faraway cry of birds. It was peaceful, but beneath the peace was a faint tension, an edge that neither of them could name. It was as though the stillness of the world was holding its breath. Morty noticed it first when they resumed their walk. The air felt heavier, not darker, but charged like the hush before a storm. Even the flowers along the path seemed to bow a little lower, their colours deepening as if in anticipation. He glanced at Rick, who walked with his gaze fixed forward, his jaw set. "Rick," Morty said cautiously, "nah, do you feel it? Like something's different?" Rick's silence stretched long before he answered. "Yeah, the world's shifting. Can't tell if it's for us or against us yet. But it's shifting." Morty swallowed, his eyes darting to the sky, where clouds had begun to gather in pale clusters, drifting slowly, deliberately. He felt the weight of change pressing around them, though he couldn't yet see its shape. By the time they reached the crest of the trail, the sun had already begun to lean westward. They stood together, gazing out over a new stretch of land, rolling hills, dotted with clusters of trees, streams weaving silver patterns, and beyond it all, mountains rising like ancient guardians, their peaks lost in drifting mist. Morty's heart thudded at the sight. The mountains looked unreachable, eternal, as though carved not for men but for gods. "We're going there, aren't we?" he asked quietly. Rick exhaled, his breath slow, steady, but carrying something Morty couldn't quite read. "Yeah, we don't have a choice. That's where the path leads." The boy nodded, though a faint unease stirred in his chest. The mountains seemed beautiful, but their beauty carried weight, like a secret waiting to be revealed. As they descended into the hills, evening fell in slow gradients, first the gold softening into rose, then fading into violet, then deepening into blue. The air grew cooler, and the first stars pricked the horizon. They made camp near a cluster of trees, the fire crackling softly as night wrapped around them. Morty sat close to the flames, his face lit in amber glow, his hands turning over a small stone he had picked up along the trail. It was smooth, almost perfectly round, and he kept running his fingers along its surface as though the act itself carried comfort. Rick sat opposite, his gaze fixed not on the fire, but on the dark line of mountains in the distance. His expression was still, but his eyes held a storm of thought. "Rick," Morty's voice was soft, hesitant. "Do you think the mountains will have answers? About why we're here? About what it all means?" Rick leaned back, the firelight flickering across his face. "Maybe. Or maybe they'll just have more questions." "That's the thing, Morty. Every answer leads to another door. Every door opens to another room. You never stop walking through them. But sometimes the walk itself becomes the meaning." Morty stared into the fire, his fingers tightening around the stone. The words felt heavier tonight, carrying with them the weight of the unseen, the unspoken. He didn't fully understand them, but something in his heart told him they mattered. The fire burned low, sparks rising into the vast dark. The stars wheeled above, ancient and unblinking, watching as the boy and the old man sat together, the mountains waiting silently in the distance. And as sleep finally pulled them under, the world seemed to shift again, subtle, quiet, but certain. Something was stirring, and the story they carried was about to change. Morning came softly, as though reluctant to disturb the silence that had settled around them. The fire was nothing but ash now, scattered like pale grey feathers across the earth, and the trees overhead whispered faintly as the breeze stirred their branches. Morty woke first this time, his body wrapped in the calm of sleep, his eyes adjusting slowly to the dim light filtering through the leaves. He looked over at Rick, who was already awake, sitting with his back against a tree, gaze fixed on the distant mountains. His posture was still, but his fingers twitched against the fabric of his coat, restless, as though part of him could never fully be at peace. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" Morty asked quietly. Rick gave a soft grunt, not turning his head. Didn't need to. Some nights it's easier to just listen. Morty frowned, still heavy with sleep. Listen to what? Rick's eyes remained locked on the horizon. To the world breathing. To the parts of it that don't make noise but still speak. Morty sat up, pulling his knees to his chest, trying to hear what Rick did. At first, all he caught was the rustle of leaves, the faint chirp of birds beginning their day, the sigh of the wind threading through the grass. But the longer he sat, the more he felt it, not heard, but felt. A pulse beneath the surface, a rhythm older than anything he had known. It was quiet, steady, like a hidden heart beating beneath the soil and stone. They ate in silence, bread and dried fruit that seemed far too small to hold them for long, but neither complained. Their minds were elsewhere, on the trail ahead, on the shadow of the mountains that loomed larger with each passing hour. The path wound steadily upward now through hills that swelled like the backs of sleeping giants. The grass brushed their legs damp with morning dew, and the air grew sharper, carrying a crispness that stung the lungs and woke the blood. Morty kept glancing at the peaks in the distance, their crowns still shrouded in drifting mists, untouchable, unyielding. As the day stretched, the silence between them deepened, not with distance, but with weight. They spoke little, their words replaced by the steady rhythm of footsteps and the whisper of the wind. Yet within the silence, Morty's thoughts tangled. Questions rose like smoke about the path, about why they had been brought here, about what awaited them among the stones. By midday, they reached a small ridge where the land fell away, revealing a vast sweep of forest. Trees stretched endlessly, a sea of green stirred by the breath of the sky. The sight made Morty pause, his chest tightening. It was beautiful, yes, but it also felt immense, endless and humbling. "Rick," he said softly, what if we never find what we're looking for? What if it's just walking forever?" Rick leaned against a boulder, squinting into the distance. "Then maybe that's the point, Morty. Maybe it's not about the finding. Maybe it's about learning to keep walking, even when you don't know where it ends." Morty fell quiet, chewing on the words as the forest whispered below. Something in Rick's tone was different this time, less bitter, less detached. It carried a trace of something fragile, almost human. They descended into the woods, the light dimming as branches closed above them. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, damp and alive. Every step pressed into soft soil, every breath drew in the deep memory of the trees. Morty's unease grew, not from fear, but from the sense that they were entering a place that remembered more than they ever could. The deeper they walked, the stranger it felt. The forest grew denser, the air heavier, until even the birdsong faded, replaced by a silence so complete it pressed against their ears. The trees leaned closer, their trunks wide, gnarled with age, their roots twisting like veins into the earth. Morty shivered, pulling his jacket tighter. "Rick! It's too quiet. Why is it so quiet?" Rick glanced upward, his expression unreadable. "Forests like this don't waste words. They hold on to them. Everything here is older than us, older than the path we're walking. You can feel it if you let yourself." And Morty did feel it. The same pulse he had sensed earlier by the camp now thrummed beneath his feet, stronger, steadier, like a hidden drum keeping time. It unnerved him, but it also drew him in. He found himself slowing, brushing his hand against the bark of a tree, feeling its roughness, its steady life humming beneath the surface. They camped that night beneath the canopy, a small fire crackling weakly, its light struggling against the thick darkness. Morty sat close to Rick, the forest pressing heavy around them, its silence deeper than any night before. "Rick," Morty whispered, do you ever feel like we're being watched?" Rick didn't answer at first. He poured a measure of water into his hand, watching it slip through his fingers. Finally, he said, "Always." But not all watching is dangerous. Sometimes it's just the world reminding you that you're not as alone as you think. Morty turned his gaze toward the trees, their shapes barely visible beyond the firelight. He wanted to believe Rick, wanted to take comfort in the thought. But the unease lingered like a shadow at the edge of sight. When sleep came, it was heavy, filled with dreams that felt less like imagination and more like memory. Morty dreamed of roots winding through endless soil, of stone faces carved into cliffs, of stars that burned not with light, but with thought. He woke in the night once, heart racing, the fire nearly gone. Rick was still awake, sitting in silence, staring into the dark as though it spoke to him in words Morty couldn't hear. Morning broke again, soft and muted, the forest holding the light in its arms. They rose, weary but unbroken, and began walking once more. The path was narrower now, leading them deeper, guiding them toward the mountains that loomed ever nearer, their shadows spilling across the land. And as they walked, Morty couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, not with malice, but with patience. As though the mountains themselves had been expecting their arrival, and the forest was simply leading them to the threshold. The world around them held its breath, and somewhere deep inside, Morty did too. The morning light in the forest was unlike any other. It did not fall in golden streams nor burst through the leaves with joy. Instead, it filtered slowly, muted, as if cautious, to disturb the heavy silence that lingered among the trees. Mist still clung to the ground, curling around their boots as they walked, softening their footsteps until it seemed they moved not upon earth, but through memory. Morty rubbed his arms as though to fight off the chill. His breath clouded in front of him, vanishing almost at once in the thick air. Rick walked ahead, unhurried, yet his posture betrayed alertness, the way his eyes flicked toward shadows, the way his shoulders stayed tight, as though expecting the forest itself to shift. "Rick," Morty whispered, unwilling to raise his voice, "why does it feel like this place doesn't want us here?" Rick slowed, resting a hand on the bark of a towering tree, his fingers tracing the grooves. "Maybe it's not that it doesn't want us here," he murmured. "Maybe it just wants to see if we'll listen before it lets us pass." Morty frowned. "Listen? To trees?" Rick gave the faintest hint of a smile, though it was more weary than amused. "To more than trees. The ground, the silence. Everything here remembers, and memories don't like to be ignored." They continued, each step deeper into the quiet heart of the forest. The further they went, the more Morty felt it, the sense of something vast watching them, not with eyes but with presence. Every rustle of a leaf, every creak of a branch above, seemed like the breath of something ancient and unseen. At midday, the mist thinned, revealing a clearing ringed by stones. The stones were tall, weathered by centuries, their surfaces scarred with grooves that might have been words once, or warnings, though the language was lost. Moss climbed their flanks, and between them the grass grew darker, almost black in places, as though the soil itself remembered fire. Rick stopped at the edge, his gaze sharpening. "Well, looks like we found one of the old marks." Morty stared, uneasy. "What kind of mark?" Rick crouched, brushing his hand over the surface of the nearest stone. His touch was light, almost reverent. "Markers left behind by those who walked this land long before us. Travelers, wanderers, maybe even the builders of the mountains themselves. Could have been warnings, could have been prayers. Morty's stomach tightened. Warnings? You mean like danger? Rick's silence was answer enough. They ate sparingly in the clearing, though Morty found it hard to swallow. The air was thick, charged, as though the stones hummed with something only half forgotten. He noticed the way the wind avoided the circle, skirting its edges but never crossing inside. Even the birds that had briefly returned to the canopy above stayed away from this place. As they rose to leave, Morty glanced back one last time. The stones seemed taller now, their shadows stretching further, as if they had shifted when he wasn't looking. He shivered and hurried to catch up with Rick. The path grew narrower beyond the clearing, weaving between roots that jutted from the earth like the bones of some buried giant. The air grew colder, though no wind stirred. Time itself felt strange here, hours stretching, compressing, dissolving, until Morty could no longer tell if they had walked a day or only moments. When night finally came, it did not fall like before. It descended suddenly, a curtain of darkness that smothered the forest. Their fire seemed weaker against it, its light swallowed quickly, leaving little more than a trembling glow. Morty huddled close, his eyes darting to the shapes between the trees, convinced they shifted when he looked away. "Rick," he whispered, "you see that, right?" "The way the dark moves?" Rick stared into the flames, his face lined with shadows. "Don't give it more shape than it already has, Morty. Fear likes to feed itself." "But what if it's not just fear?" Rick's eyes lifted, sharp and tired all at once. "Then you'll know when it wants you to. Until then, don't invite it closer." Morty swallowed hard, falling silent. He lay down eventually, but sleep came only in broken fragments. His dreams twisted, filled with trees that bent down to whisper his name, with stones that opened like eyes, with shadows that stretched long fingers toward him. Each time he woke, the fire was smaller, and Rick was still awake, sitting like a sentinel against the dark. By dawn, Morty's body ached with exhaustion. Yet when he opened his eyes to the dim grey light, something had shifted. The forest no longer felt as though it was holding its breath. Instead, it felt as though it had accepted them, at least for now. The air was lighter, and though the silence still lingered, it was not suffocating. They pressed onward. The mountains were closer now, their jagged peaks revealed through gaps in the canopy, their crowns no longer hidden by mist. Morty stared up at them, both awe and dread knotting in his chest. "Rick," he said softly, "it feels like they're waiting for us." Rick glanced at him and for once did not deny it. Maybe they are. The path steepened, the soil giving way to rock, the forest slowly thinning. The trees grew sparser, their trunks scarred as though lightning had struck them again and again. The air sharpened further, filling their lungs with a thin, biting clarity. By the time the sun began to fall again, they reached a ridge where the forest ended abruptly, spilling into a barren stretch of stone. Behind them, the woods spread endlessly, a sea of shadow and green. Ahead, the mountains towered, immense and solemn, their slopes carved with ridges that looked like scars, their peaks etched against the darkening sky. Morty stood in silence, the sheer immensity of them stealing his words. He felt small, fragile, as though he had been reduced to little more than a flicker of light against their vastness. Rick rested a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "This is the threshold, Morty. Beyond here, nothing stays the same. You ready?" Morty swallowed, his voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know." Rick's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "That's the right answer." They stood together as the last light bled from the sky, the mountains looming before them like ancient judges, and though Morty's heart pounded with fear, Some part of him knew that this was only the beginning, that whatever waited beyond those slopes was older, vaster, and more patient than anything they had yet faced. The forest had tested them. The stones had marked their path. Now the mountains called. The first step upon the mountains was heavier than Morty expected. The ground beneath his boots was not the soft soil of the forest, but jagged stone, sharp and unyielding, as if reminding him that the earth here was not meant for comfort. The air thinned quickly, each breath drawn in with effort, carrying a crispness that burned his lungs. Rick walked steadily ahead, his figure outlined by the pale glow of morning. Behind them, the forest stretched vast and shadowed, its mists curling at the edge of the stone ridge like a living thing reluctant to follow. Before them, the mountains rose higher with every step, their peaks hidden in cloud, their slopes carved in silence. The path was no true trail, only a rough line where stone had broken away long ago, leaving narrow ledges that hugged the cliffs. Morty clung close to the rock, his stomach tightening each time the ground sloped toward a yawning abyss. Wind whistled through the chasms below, a deep, hollow sound that seemed less like air moving and more like the mountain exhaling. "Rick," Morty whispered, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "Are you sure about this path? What if it just ends?" Rick didn't slow. "Then we make another one." Morty blinked, his throat dry. "That's not comforting." Rick gave a small, tired chuckle. "It's not supposed to be." Hours passed in that thin, merciless air. Shadows moved across the cliffs as the sun drifted overhead, yet the peaks remained untouchable, shrouded in cloud. The stone itself seemed alive with echoes, the crack of small rocks tumbling down slopes, the distant roar of shifting avalanches that never showed themselves, the faint hum of wind as it threaded through caverns deep within. They paused at a narrow ledge to rest. Morty sat with his back pressed against the rock, afraid to glance over the drop beside him. His legs trembled from the climb, but more than that, it was the sheer silence of the mountains that unsettled him. The forest had whispered, rustled, breathed. The mountains did not. They only watched. Rick pulled a flask from his coat, sipping slowly before passing it over. Morty drank, the water cold enough to sting. He wiped his mouth and stared upward. "Rick, do you think anyone's ever climbed this way before?" Rick's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "If they did, the mountain remembers. Doesn't mean it'll tell us." Morty frowned. "Why do you always make it sound like everything's alive?" Rick's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because in places like this, it's safer to assume it is." They resumed their climb as the day waned. The higher they went, the more the wind tore at them, tugging at their clothes, whistling sharp through cracks in the stone. At times, Morty swore the gusts carried voices, faint murmurs that rose and fell like half-formed words. He tried not to listen, but the sound clung to his thoughts, threading into his fear, until he could no longer tell if the voices were within the wind or within himself. By evening, the path narrowed to a bridge of stone, no wider than their boots. Below, the abyss opened into darkness, endless and hollow. Rick crossed first, his step steady, though Morty saw how his fingers brushed the cliffside for balance. Morty followed, heart pounding, each step a fragile defiance against the void. Halfway across he froze, the world tilting beneath him, the abyss pulling. "Rick!" he gasped, his body trembling. I can't." Rick turned, his eyes sharp. "Don't look down, Morty! Look at me!" Morty forced his gaze upward, Rick's hand extended toward him, steady and sure. "One step," Rick said, "then another. That's all it is." The wind howled around them, But Morty fixed his eyes on Rick's hand. He moved one step, then another, until at last his boots struck solid ground. Rick pulled him forward, gripping his shoulder until the tremor in Morty's legs eased. They stood together, the abyss behind them, the mountain stretching still higher. Morty's chest heaved with uneven breaths, but a small, fragile spark of pride warmed him. He had crossed. He had not fallen. The sun dipped low, bleeding orange across the peaks, and shadows deepened in the valleys below. They made camp in a shallow alcove carved into the stone, lighting a small fire that barely pushed back the cold. The flames danced, their light throwing strange patterns against the rock, shapes that almost looked like figures moving, reaching, bending. Morty huddled close, his blanket wrapped tightly, his mind still replaying the crossing. Rick sat in silence, staring out at the horizon where the last of the light faded. After a long while, Morty spoke, his voice quiet. "Rick, why are we even going up here? What's waiting for us?" Rick didn't answer immediately. His face was drawn, eyes reflecting the fire's glow. Finally he said, "Sometimes, Morty, the climb isn't about what waits at the top. It's about whether you can carry yourself through the mountain's silence without losing who you are." Morty frowned, unsettled. "And if you do lose yourself?" Rick's gaze flicked toward him, sharp and tired. "Then the mountain
keeps you." Silence fell again, heavier than the stone around them. Morty lay down eventually, but his sleep was restless. He dreamed of endless climbs, of narrow paths that twisted into nothing, of shadows that stretched long fingers across the stone. Each time he woke, the fire burned lower, and Rick was still awake, a dark figure against the mountain's vast silence. When dawn came, it was pale and cold, the sky bruised with clouds. They packed their things in silence, and as Morty glanced once more at the abyss they had crossed, he realized the mountain had already changed him. It had tested his fear, it had taken his breath, it had shown him how small he truly was. And the climb had only just begun. The morning came without warmth. The sky above was a dim grey, clouded and heavy, its weight pressing down on the jagged peaks. Rick and Morty began their climb once more, their boots scraping against stones slick with frost. Each step carried the cold deeper into their bones, as though the mountain itself sought to freeze them from within. The path wound higher, narrowing and twisting, until it seemed less like a way forward and more like a trial designed to turn them back. The silence was immense, broken only by the crunch of their steps and the whistle of wind through unseen cracks. Morty found himself straining for any sound beyond those, anything human, anything familiar. But there was nothing. The mountain was vast, and they were small, and the silence pressed around them like a second skin. After hours of climbing, they reached a ledge where the stone broadened into a plateau. The view stretched endlessly, peaks upon peaks fading into a haze of cloud. Morty's legs ached, but as he caught his breath, he noticed something strange. Carved into the stone beneath their feet were faint lines, too deliberate to be cracks. "Rick," he whispered, crouching low, "look at this." Rick joined him, brushing away a thin layer of frost. The marks resolved into patterns, circles intersecting with lines, symbols etched deep into the rock. They were old, their edges worn by centuries of wind and ice, but the intent remained. It was not the careless work of nature, it was writing. Morty shivered. "Do you think someone lived up here?" Rick's eyes lingered on the symbols, his expression unreadable. "Not lived, passed through. Left their mark so the mountain would remember." "Remember what?" Rick didn't answer. He traced one of the symbols with his gloved finger, then stood. His silence said more than words. They pressed onward, the plateau giving way to a jagged incline that led toward a darker stretch of stone. Here the mountain seemed different, less raw, more shaped. The walls rose unnaturally smooth in places, and Morty could almost imagine vast hands carving them long before his time. The air carried a hum now, faint but steady, like the low resonance of something buried deep in the rock. The further they went, the stronger the hum became. It wasn't sound in the ordinary sense. It was vibration, pressing into their bones, threading through their breath. Morty placed his hand against the cliff and felt it thrumming, as though the mountain itself had a heartbeat. "Rick," he said uneasily, "I don't like this." Rick gave him a sidelong glance. "You're not supposed to." The path ended abruptly at a sheer wall. For a moment, Morty thought they'd reached a dead end, but then he saw it, an opening, a narrow cleft in the stone, so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it. The hum pulsed stronger here, carrying with it a weight that pressed against his chest. Rick stepped closer, peering into the black. "This is it," he murmured. Morty's throat tightened. "Here! What do you mean it? It's just a hole in the mountain." Rick didn't respond. He pulled a lantern from his pack, striking it alight. The glow flickered against the stone, revealing edges smoothed not by nature but by hands long vanished. The passageway beckoned, a throat of darkness waiting to be entered. Morty hesitated, his legs rooted. "Rick, maybe we shouldn't." Rick's voice was firm, quiet. "The mountain doesn't give you choices, Morty, only directions." Reluctantly, Morty followed as Rick stepped inside. The air grew colder instantly, heavy with damp. The sound of the wind faded until it was gone, replaced only by the echo of their footsteps and the constant, steady hum. The lantern's light licked the walls, revealing more of the etched symbols, spiraling and interlocking, running deeper into the passage. It felt endless. Each step pulled them further into the mountain's belly, where time and distance lost meaning. Morty's heart beat faster, his breaths shallow. He swore shadows moved just beyond the light, shapes curling and dissolving as soon as he turned his head. Finally, the passage opened into a vast chamber. The ceiling soared out of sight, the walls marked with more of those ancient carvings. At the center stood a monolith, tall and unbroken, carved from a darker stone than the rest. Its surface pulsed faintly, as if lit from within by something that was not flame. Morty froze, his entire body trembling. "Rick, what is that?" Rick's eyes were fixed on the monolith, his face pale in the lantern glow. "A memory," he said at last. The hum deepened, resonating through the chamber. Morty felt it crawling beneath his skin, sinking into his bones, filling his head with a pressure that bordered on pain. His vision blurred at the edges, and in that blur he thought he saw figures, shadows pressed into the stone itself, their forms locked in endless silence. Morty staggered back. "Rick, we shouldn't be here." Rick remained still, his gaze unblinking. "The mountain wanted us here." The monolith pulsed again, stronger as though it had heard him. The light within it flickered like a heartbeat, and the chamber trembled faintly, dust drifting from the unseen ceiling above. Morty clutched his head, his ears ringing, his thoughts unraveling into whispers that weren't his own. And then, silence. The hum ceased, sudden and absolute. The chamber grew still, the monolith dark. The weight pressing against Morty's chest lifted, leaving only his ragged breathing in its place. He turned to Rick, but Rick's face was unreadable, his eyes reflecting the last fading glow of the lantern. "We keep moving," Rick said, his voice low. Morty wanted to protest, to scream, to beg them to leave the mountain and never return.
But the words died in his throat. The silence of the chamber was worse than any noise. It clung to him, gnawed at him, and he understood then what Rick had meant. The mountain did not give choices, it only gave directions. And they had just taken a step into something far older than themselves. The chamber held its breath. Rick and Morty stood in the wake of silence, so deep it seemed alive, pressing against their ears until even the beat of their own hearts felt intrusive. The monolith, once pulsing within a light, now loomed inert, yet the memory of its glow clung to Morty's eyes, leaving a phantom shimmer across the dark. He whispered, his voice trembling. "Rick, what just happened?" Rick didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the monolith, as if weighing something only he could hear. At last he murmured, "It woke up." Morty's stomach tightened. "Woke up, but it stopped glowing." "That's not the same thing." Rick's tone was flat, stripped of reassurance. He turned his lantern slightly, the light skimming across the walls. The carvings there seemed sharper now, more defined, as if they had shifted subtly when the monolith stirred. Lines that had once been faded looked freshly carved, their grooves darker, deeper, as though alive with some unseen ink. Morty felt sweat prick beneath his collar despite the cold. "Rick, we can't stay here. Please, let's just leave. Before whatever this is comes back." Rick gave a humorless smirk. "Leave? Morty, the moment we stepped inside, leaving stopped being an option." The words landed heavy, a truth Morty didn't want to accept. He glanced around the chamber, his imagination catching movement in every shadow. He swore the air itself pulsed, like invisible lungs inhaling and exhaling slowly around them. Then came the sound. Faint at first, like the brushing of fabric across stone. It grew steadily, echoing from somewhere deep within the chamber, though no source could be seen. It wasn't footsteps, it wasn't wind, it was something else entirely, an ancient rustling, as if pages of an endless book were turning in the dark. Morty clutched his arms to steady himself. "Rick, do you hear that?" Rick raised a hand for silence. His expression hardened, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. They stood still, listening, as the sound swelled, rolled, then stilled once more, vanishing back into the vastness of the chamber. For a moment Morty thought it was gone. But then the walls shivered. Not visibly, not with any quake that could topple stone, but with a vibration that entered through the skin and set the marrow trembling. The carvings glowed faintly now, not with light, but with a strange depth, as though they had become windows to something beyond. Morty dared a glance at Rick, whose face was drawn tight with thought. "It's remembering us," Rick said quietly. "Remembering us? How can a mountain remember anything?" "Because it was made to." The answer chilled Morty more than the cold stone ever could. His mouth went dry, his thoughts tangling in fear. "Made to by who?" Rick's eyes flicked to the monolith. "By whoever thought it mattered that we'd come here. Or by whoever wanted to make sure we'd never forget." The lantern flickered, its flames straining as though a draft passed through, though Morty felt no wind. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, curling in ways the flame could not explain. One of them lingered, even when the lantern dipped back, holding its form for a heartbeat too long before melting away. Morty stumbled back, voice cracking. "Rick, did you see that?" Rick's jaw clenched, but he did not deny it. He simply turned toward the passage they had entered from. Yet when the lantern light touched it, Morty felt his stomach sink. It was gone. The entrance, the narrow cleft of stone that had led them here, was no longer visible. The wall was whole, unbroken, smooth as though it had never been carved. Morty's breathing quickened. No, Rick. The way out, it's gone. Rick remained still, though his silence was more dangerous than panic. Finally, he spoke, voice low. Not gone. Closed. The word sent a fresh wave of terror through Morty. Closed? By what? Rick's gaze lifted back to the monolith. The dark stone sat unmoving at the chamber's center, yet Morty swore it seemed heavier now, as if its presence alone bent the space around it. Rick adjusted his grip on the lantern. By the same thing that opened it in the first place. The rustling returned, louder this time, curling around them like whispers. Morty couldn't make out the words, if they even were words, but they slithered into his ears, planting unease deep inside. He pressed his hands against the sides of his head, squeezing shut his eyes, but the whispers only grew clearer. Shapes of voices, echoes of something long dead or never alive at all. "Rick!" Morty shouted, his voice breaking. "What do they want?" Rick stared at the monolith, his expression carved from stone. "Not want, tell." "Tell what?" Rick's voice fell to a whisper. "That we've been seen." The lantern guttered again, then flared. The carvings on the walls brightened for an instant, not with light, but with an illusion of depth, as if Morty were staring into vast spaces far beyond the stone. For the briefest moment he glimpsed shapes moving there, too large, too fluid, too wrong. He staggered, his knees weak. "Rick, I don't want to be here anymore." Rick laid a hand on his shoulder, surprisingly steady, surprisingly human. "Neither do I, Morty." But they both knew it wasn't their choice. The whispers faded, leaving only silence once more. The chamber stood vast and still, the monolith dark, the walls unmoving. Yet the path out remained sealed, and Morty could not shake the sense that the mountain had shifted closer, that it now wrapped around them like a living shell. Rick lifted the lantern higher, his voice grim. "There's another way through. There always is, but it's never free." Morty didn't want to ask what that meant. He didn't want the answer. All he knew was that they were trapped in a place older than memory, and the mountain was not done with them yet. And somewhere, far deeper than this chamber, something stirred awake. The silence pressed down heavier than stone, and Morty realized that silence here wasn't empty at all. It was watching. Every breath he took seemed too loud, each beat of his heart like a hammer on the cavern floor. Rick raised the lantern higher, its trembling light casting wild shapes across the walls. For a moment Morty thought the stone itself leaned closer, listening. "Rick," he whispered, though even that felt dangerous. "What if we can't get out?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He stood very still, studying the carvings as though they were not decorations, but instructions. Finally, he muttered, "You don't build something like this without an exit." "But the exit isn't for us, it's for it." Morty's mouth went dry. It? You mean the monolith?" Rick gave a humorless snort. "That's not a monolith, Morty, that's a door." Morty's stomach dropped. His eyes flicked to the great block of stone in the center of the chamber. It stood silent, black and unyielding, but now, after Rick's words, it looked different, like the heavy lid of a tomb, a door that wasn't meant to be opened from their side. Then we should just leave it," Morty stammered, panic rising in his throat. "Find another way, climb out, dig out, anything, just don't open it, Rick." But Rick was already stepping closer. "Morty," he said, voice sharp but quiet, "listen to me. Things like this, they're built with choice. You can run in circles forever, or you can face it. And it always makes sure you'll face it. The words fell like iron. Morty hugged himself, shivering. His skin crawled with the feeling that something waited just beyond that stone surface, something vast and patient. The lantern flame sputtered, then surged suddenly higher, flooding the chamber in golden light. Morty blinked, shielding his eyes. The carvings around them blazed to life, each groove catching fire bright, turning the chamber into a living map of light and shadow. And then the rustling returned, not faint now, not hidden, but thunderous, a sea of whispers rolling across the stone, circling them like invisible waves. Morty clamped his hands to his ears, but the sound pressed through flesh and bone, rising from inside his chest. He could almost hear words forming. Too many voices speaking as one. Rick grimaced, pulling a small device from his coat. It buzzed weakly, its lights flickering in response to the voices. "Yeah," he muttered darkly. "I thought so." Morty's voice cracked. "What? Thought what?" Rick didn't look at him. "We're not in a mountain anymore." Morty froze. His breath stilled. The chamber felt suddenly wrong, larger than it had any right to be. He dared a glance at the walls, only now they didn't feel like walls at all, but veils, thin as smoke. Behind them stretched a vastness too deep to comprehend, shadows writhing in endless distance. His chest tightened. "Rick, stop. Please, let's not look at it." Rick ignored him, walking up to the monolith, lantern shaking in his hand. The voices surged as he approached, rising to a near-deafening pitch. Morty fell to his knees, pressing his forehead to the cold stone floor, anything to shut it out. Then suddenly silence again. Morty lifted his head slowly. Rick stood with his palm pressed flat against the monolith. The lantern at his side burned steady now, unflinching. For a moment, Morty thought the stone itself pulsed beneath Rick's hand, like the slow beat of a buried heart. Rick spoke, voice low. "It knows us." Morty's throat closed. "Knows us? Rick, how can it know us?" Rick glanced back, his expression shadowed. "Because everything down here is older than remembering, and when something that old notices you..." He let the thought hang, unfinished. The monolith stirred. Morty saw it. Not a movement of stone, but a shifting of weight, of presence. The dark surface rippled faintly, as if a layer beneath it struggled to surface. For a breathless moment, it reflected Rick and Morty not as they were, but as strangers, figures stretched tall, eyes hollow, their shadows bending in unnatural directions. Morty gasped and stumbled backward. "Rick! Rick, don't touch it!" Rick pulled his hand back slowly. The reflection vanished. The monolith sank once more into stillness. But the chamber had changed. The entrance behind them was no longer sealed. It stood open again, a narrow passage yawning into darkness. Morty's heart leapt with relief. "Rick, the way out! It's open!" But Rick's eyes narrowed. "That's not an exit, Morty. That's an invitation." The words hit Morty like a blow. He stared at the passage, his hope curdling into dread. He could feel it now, the pull, gentle but insistent, like a current drawing them forward. He turned back to Rick. "What do we do?" Rick's face was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "We go. 'Cause if we stay, it won't wait long before opening the real door." Morty wanted to argue, to scream, to collapse and refuse. But the weight of the chamber pressed too heavily on him, the whispers still echoing at the edge of hearing. With shaking legs he followed Rick toward the passage. The lantern light bobbed as they walked, each step swallowed by the black. The monolith behind them faded into shadow, but Morty couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't let them go at all, that it was following, silently, through the dark. And as they crossed the threshold into the waiting tunnel, Morty knew with a sinking certainty the mountain wasn't closing around them, it was leading them deeper in. The tunnel stretched out before them like the throat of something alive, damp stone glistening faintly in the light of Rick's lantern. The air was heavier here, thick, with a metallic tang that clung to Morty's tongue, making every breath feel tainted. He tried not to look too closely at the walls, but his eyes betrayed him. He kept catching glimpses of shapes in the rock, faces blurred, half-formed, as if something had tried to crawl out and been swallowed back. "Rick," Morty whispered, voice trembling, This doesn't feel like just stone anymore." Rick didn't answer. His steps were steady, but Morty could see the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he kept the lantern close, as if daring the dark to come nearer. The silence pressed in, broken only by the echo of their footsteps. And yet, Morty couldn't shake the sensation that there were more footsteps than theirs, faint but perfectly timed, as though the tunnel itself walked with them. The passage twisted sharply, opening into a narrow chamber. Here the air was colder and the ceiling dipped low, forcing Morty to hunch. Strange markings ran across the walls, not carved but burned deep into the stone, glowing faintly as though embers lived beneath the surface. Morty's breath caught. They're like the ones in the other chamber," he said, voice almost a whimper. "But these are moving." Rick raised the lantern, and sure enough, the patterns writhed slowly, coils of light twisting into new shapes, forming and unforming symbols too alien to grasp. Rick's jaw tightened. "Yeah, language, not for us." Morty hugged his arms tight to his chest. "Then why are we seeing it?" Rick glanced at him, eyes shadowed. "Because it wants us to." The words landed with the weight of truth. Morty's knees weakened, but he forced himself forward, following Rick. The tunnel narrowed again, winding deeper, until the air grew staler, pressing like water against their lungs. Morty's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The lantern flickered, shadows jumping wildly across the walls. Then the sound began. It was faint at first, like a low hum running beneath the stone. Morty froze. The hum swelled, vibrating through his bones, growing into a pulse, a rhythm like some enormous heart beating in the deep. The walls trembled with it, dust raining softly from the ceiling. Morty clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him now, resonating through his ribs. Rick, make it stop," he begged. Rick adjusted the dials on the device he carried, its lights stuttering in chaotic bursts. He cursed under his breath. "It's not sound, Morty. It's resonance. We're being tuned." "Tuned? What does that mean?" Rick didn't answer, but his grim expression said enough. The tunnel widened abruptly into another chamber, this one vast and circular, its walls lined with black stone that glistened as though wet. At the center rose a structure unlike anything Morty had ever seen, a pillar of translucent material, faintly luminous from within. Shapes writhed inside it, indistinct but wriggling, as if trapped in liquid amber. Morty's stomach twisted violently. "Oh God, Rick, what is that?" Rick held the lantern high, his eyes scanning the pillar. His voice was flat, controlled. "A core, anchor, maybe a seed." Morty stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. "A seed? For what?" The pillar pulsed faintly, the glow within quickening like a heartbeat responding to their presence. The hum deepened, filling the chamber, drowning Morty's thoughts in its crushing rhythm. His vision blurred at the edges. He fell to his knees, hands trembling against the stone floor. "Morty!" Rick's voice cut through, sharp. He gripped Morty's arm, hauling him upright. "Don't give it focus. Don't listen too hard. That's how it gets in." But Morty couldn't stop. The glow from the pillar drew his eyes like gravity, dragging his mind down into its shifting shapes. He swore he saw figures inside, limbs stretching, faces forming, eyes blinking awake in the slow tide of light, and behind them something vaster, coiled like an ocean trench, waiting. Tears burned Morty's eyes. "Rick, it sees me!" Rick tightened his grip, shaking him hard. "Look at me, Morty, not at me! You hear me?" Morty gasped, his vision snapping back to Rick's face. The hum dulled slightly, though it still pressed against his bones. Rick's expression was grim, sweat beading his forehead. "Listen," Rick said, voice low, urgent. "This thing, whatever it is, it's not showing us because it's curious. It's showing us because it feeds. It draws out fear, thought, memory. You give it an inch, it takes everything." Morty nodded weakly, clutching Rick's sleeve. But even as Rick spoke, the glow from the pillar swelled, filling the chamber in waves of pale light. The figures within pressed closer to the surface, their outlines growing sharper. Morty could almost make out their faces now, hollow-eyed and stretched wide in silent screams. Rick raised the device again, twisting its controls. It whined, sputtering with static. The hum wavered, faltering for a moment before surging back stronger. Rick cursed. "It's too deep. Can't jam it from here." Morty's panic flared again. "Then what do we do?" Rick's eyes darted to the pillar, his jaw set. "We move. There's always another chamber. This isn't the end." The words rang hollow, but Morty clung to them anyway. Together they stumbled past the pillar, hugging the far wall. The glow chased them, shadows stretching long and distorted, faces twisting in the light like masks. At the far end of the chamber, another passage yawned open. Rick didn't hesitate. They plunged inside, the hum fading behind them, but never truly gone, still pulsing faintly through the stone. The tunnel here was narrower, colder. The air tasted of ash. Morty staggered, breath ragged, tears streaking his face. Rick kept his arm around him, dragging him forward step by step. At last, the passage split. Two paths lay ahead, one sloping upward into faint gloom, the other plunging deeper, vanishing into blackness. Morty stared, chest heaving. "Rick! Which way?" Rick stood still, lantern trembling faintly in his hand. His face was unreadable, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The hum vibrated faintly through the floor, as if waiting for their choice. After a long silence, Rick spoke, voice low and steady. "Doesn't matter, Morty. Either way, we're not walking out, we're walking in." The fork in the tunnel loomed before them like a decision carved into eternity. One path bent upward, a faint grey light seeping from its unseen heights, while the other plunged downward, a wound of absolute black. Morty's breath came fast and shallow, his eyes darting between the two ways as though the stone itself might shift to swallow them whole. "Rick," Morty's voice was small, cracking. "If you're saying it doesn't matter, then how do we choose?" Rick stared at the divide, lantern casting twin shadows that flickered like phantoms across the walls. His silence stretched long enough that Morty thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, Rick said, "It's not about choosing right. It's about surviving the wrong choice long enough to keep moving." The words chilled Morty worse than the air. Rick stepped forward without hesitation, angling toward the descending path. Morty's stomach twisted violently. The dark one. Up means hope, Morty, and these things, they dangle hope like bait. Rick's eyes glinted in the lantern glow, tired but sharp. If you see a way out, assume it's the trap. If you see the pit, that's where the truth is. Morty swallowed hard, forcing his feet to follow Rick into the downward throat of stone. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, until Morty's breath fogged before his face. The walls wet moisture, and every droplet seemed to echo like a whisper in the silence. The lantern's light barely pushed the dark back now, as if the blackness itself were alive, pressing inward, hungry. Morty tried not to think, but his mind rebelled, tossing up images of the pillar they had left behind, the faces, the writhing, the sense of something vast watching. He hugged himself, teeth chattering. Rick! What if going down just takes us closer to it? Rick's voice was steady, though Morty could hear the strain beneath. Morty, we're already inside it. Every step we've taken, we're in its veins. The only way out is through. The words offered no comfort. The passage wound sharply, then opened into a chamber unlike the others. The walls here were smoother, polished to a glassy sheen that reflected the lantern light in warped, dizzying ripples. Morty froze as he realized the reflections weren't quite right. His own image in the stone moved a fraction slower, eyes blinking late, mouth lagging behind. Rick, do you see that?" Morty's voice broke, panic clawing at his throat. Rick's jaw tightened. He avoided looking directly at the reflections, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor. "Ignore it. It's not you." But Morty couldn't. His reflection tilted its head at him when he didn't, lips curling into a faint, twisted grin. Morty stumbled back, shaking his head violently. "It smiled at me! Rick! It smiled!" The lantern sputtered, shadows jerking across the chamber. Rick gripped Morty's shoulder, pulling him away from the wall. "Listen to me. The walls here aren't showing you. They're showing what it wants you to think you are. It's bait, Morty. Lies with your face." Morty squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to breathe. He let Rick drag him forward, refusing to glance at the glassy stone again. But even with his eyes closed, he could feel it, his reflection walking beside him, smiling in the dark, waiting for him to look. They pressed deeper. The hum returned, faint but steady, threading through the air like a heartbeat just beneath perception. Morty's knees wobbled, his chest tightening. "It's following us, Rick." It never stopped. Rick's answer was low, grim. "It doesn't follow, Morty. It's everywhere. You're not running from it. You're running inside it." Morty shuddered. The words pressed against his mind, heavy as the dark. The tunnel narrowed once more, forcing them into single file. Rick went ahead, lanterns scraping close to the ceiling. Morty trailed behind, every step feeling like the stone wanted to swallow his ankles. The hum grew louder, steadier, syncing with Morty's own racing pulse. His head spun. For a moment he swore the ground beneath him pulsed back, like flesh rather than rock. Then the passage spat them into another chamber, this one vast and hollow. At its center stood a staircase of rough-hewn stone, spiraling upward into darkness. Morty's breath caught in his throat. "Rick, that doesn't make sense. How can a staircase go up if we've been going down this whole time?" Rick's eyes narrowed. He raised the lantern, its glow tracing the first few steps. "Because this place doesn't care about sense. Up, down, those are our rules. This thing, it bends rules like wet paper." Morty clutched at Rick's sleeve. "So what do we do? Do we climb it?" Rick was silent for a long moment. The hum swelled, vibrating through the chamber, urging them toward the stairs. Morty could almost feel it calling, coaxing. Rick finally muttered, "That's what it wants." Which means... He turned, sweeping the lantern around the chamber's edges. The light caught on something at the far wall, a narrow crack, jagged, almost invisible in the gloom. Rick's lips curled into a grim smile. "There, that's the ugly way, which means it's the right way." Morty stared at the crack. It was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. Shadows pooled thick around it, darker than the rest of the chamber. His stomach lurched violently. "Rick, I don't want to go in there." Rick looked at him, lantern light carving deep lines into his face. "You think I do?" But Morty, in places like this, the right road never feels safe. "That's how you know it's right." Morty's throat closed, but he nodded. Together they edged toward the crack. The hum grew sharper, angrier, as though the chamber itself protested their choice. The staircase loomed behind them, pulsing faintly with light, almost begging them to climb. Morty dared a glance back, and for a heartbeat he swore he saw figures standing along the steps, waiting silently, their faces pale and hollow. He tore his eyes away and pressed into the crack behind Rick. The stone scraped his arms, his ribs, his legs. The passage was suffocatingly tight, every inch a fight for breath. The air stank of rot, thick and cloying. Morty gagged, chest tightening. I can't, Rick, I can't. Keep moving, Morty! Rick's voice echoed harshly ahead. If you stop, you don't get out! Morty sobbed, forcing himself forward, skin tearing against stone. The crack seemed endless, the dark pressing from every side, the hum vibrating like a scream trapped in his skull. His mind frayed at the edges, vision blurring. He thought he heard voices in the stone, whispering his name. At last, the crack widened suddenly, spitting them out into another chamber. Morty collapsed to the floor, gasping, chest heaving. Rick stood over him, lantern shaking faintly in his grip. His face was pale, streaked with sweat. Morty looked up, tears clinging to his lashes. Rick, how much deeper can this go? Rick's gaze drifted toward the dark tunnel yawning ahead, expression grim and unreadable. Deeper than us, Morty. Deeper than anyone ever should. The hum answered, low and endless, as though agreeing. The tunnel ahead stretched like a wound in the earth, jagged and uneven. The walls pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if breathing in rhythm with the hum that had followed them through every chamber. Morty clutched at Rick's sleeve, legs trembling, his chest heaved, and the air tasted metallic, heavy with the scent of stone and something older, something decayed yet alive. Rick, Morty whispered, voice thin, I feel like it's inside me now, like it knows my thoughts. Rick didn't answer immediately. He adjusted the lantern, flicking its light over the tunnel walls. Shadows danced unnaturally, stretching and curling into shapes that shouldn't exist. Faces flashed, pale and twisted, only to vanish the instant Morty tried to focus. Rick finally spoke, voice low and tight. Morty, you're not imagining it. It's not just around us. It's in the spaces we can't see, in the corners we can't feel. It's memory, Morty. It feeds on memory. Morty shivered. Memory? But what do you mean, my memories? Rick's eyes were dark, calculating. Everything you are, Morty, every fear, every regret, every little hope you've tried to hide, it's tasting it all. Morty stumbled, nearly tripping over a jagged stone. I don't want it. I don't want it inside me. Rick crouched briefly, gripping Morty's shoulders. Then don't give it anything, Morty. Don't look, don't think, just move. The tunnel narrowed suddenly, forcing them into single file. Morty followed Rick, shoulders hunched, heart hammering. The hum deepened, vibrating through his bones, setting his teeth to chatter despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Every step felt heavier than the last, the darkness thickening like water around them. A soft glow began to form ahead, faint and pulsing. Morty squinted. The walls themselves seemed to shimmer now, as though light were crawling across their surface. Shadows twisted into patterns, coiling around themselves, hinting at forms that should not exist. Morty's stomach lurched. Rick, what is this place? Rick didn't answer immediately, only lifted the lantern higher. This is where it shows you, he finally said, voice tight. Where the mountain, or the monolith, whatever you want to call it, lets you see the things you try to bury, the truths you're afraid of. Morty swallowed hard. Truths? I don't. A whisper slithered along the tunnel walls, curling around Morty's ears. You've been afraid, it hissed. Afraid of yourself. Morty froze. The sound was not a sound but a sensation, pressing against his skull, crawling along his nerves. He tried to shake his head, trying to escape, but his limbs felt sluggish, heavy. Rick placed a hand on his shoulder again, firm. It's testing you, Morty. It's not real. Not yet. Just keep moving. Morty forced himself forward, step by trembling step. The glow ahead intensified, revealing a circular chamber carved from the stone itself. At the center was a shallow pool, water still and black as ink. Its surface reflected the lantern light in
warped, trembling shapes. Morty looked closer and froze. The reflections weren't of him. Not exactly. They were versions of him, smaller, older, younger, each one twisted slightly, every face etched with fear or sorrow or regret. Morty's stomach churned violently. Rick, that's me. That's all of me. Rick's voice was quiet, steady. It's all of you, Morty. Every choice, every mistake, every moment you wanted to forget. And it's letting you see it, but don't let it trick you. Don't linger. Morty swallowed, tears stinging his eyes. The hum seemed louder here, pulsing through the chamber like a heartbeat that belonged to the mountain itself. He wanted to look away, to cover his eyes, but the reflections beckoned, moving subtly, curling toward him like hands made of shadow. Rick stepped forward first, lantern high, and gestured for Morty to follow. The water doesn't lie, Morty, but it doesn't judge either. You can't change what it shows, only how you face it. Morty hesitated, chest heaving. The reflections writhed as he stepped closer, shifting shapes echoing memories he'd tried to lock away. Faces of moments long past flickered. Mistakes he'd made, people he'd hurt, opportunities lost. Everyone pressed upon him, heavy and relentless. He wanted to turn away, to scream, to run. But Rick's hand on his shoulder anchored him, steady and real. The hum vibrated through the stone, but Morty focused on Rick, on the warmth of his hand, on the steady light of the lantern. The reflections in the water began to settle. Shapes straightened, shadows softened. Morty felt the weight in his chest lift slightly, the pulse in the stone fading to a slow, steady rhythm. Rick's eyes never left the water. See, Morty? It's not here to harm you. It's here to remind you what you carry. And sometimes, remembering is the only way forward. Morty exhaled slowly, shivering. The tunnel ahead seemed a little less suffocating, though the hum remained, faint and insistent. I think I understand. Rick nodded once, grim. Good, because the next chamber, it's not just memory anymore, it's choice. And this time, Morty, it wants more than just your fear, it wants your resolve. Morty swallowed hard, gripping the lantern tighter. His legs trembled, but he followed Rick forward, step by step, into the unknown. The water behind them reflected a calm he didn't feel, as though the shadows themselves had learned to wait. And somewhere in the walls the hum pulsed like a heartbeat, patient, eternal, and endless. The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into a vast chamber bathed in soft, otherworldly light. Morty blinked, eyes adjusting, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could breathe without the weight pressing on his chest. The hum that had followed them, pulsing in rhythm with his own heartbeat, was now a gentle, steady thrum, almost soothing, like the quiet lull of distant waves. Rick lowered the lantern, letting its light mingle with the soft glow filling the chamber. The walls here were smooth and warm, the stone seeming less threatening, almost familiar. Morty felt a strange calm wash over him, though he remained cautious. Every step had taught him that safety here was only temporary, a pause between trials. He glanced at Rick. We made it?
His voice was fragile, uncertain. Rick didn't answer immediately. He crouched to place the lantern on the floor, letting its glow expand across the chamber. Then he spoke softly. "We made it through, Morty. But it's not about making it. It's about noticing what survives inside you when everything else tries to break you." Morty swallowed, feeling the truth of that settle in his chest. He thought of the monolith, the reflections, the endless chambers, the hum. Everything that had pressed against his mind, pulled at his fear and memory. And yet here he was, standing, not unscathed, not unshaken, but present. The glow in the chamber shifted, faint silhouettes appearing in its light, not threatening, not moving, just there. Shadows that weren't quite shadows, reflections of moments that had haunted him, now calm, still, and somehow patient. Morty realized he was looking at the echoes of himself, versions that had been scattered through the journey. And for the first time, he felt a soft recognition, a quiet reunion. Rick stepped beside him, hand on his shoulder. "It doesn't let you leave unchanged, but it does let you leave, Morty. If you learn, if you remember, if you don't hate yourself for what you were." Morty nodded, chest still tight but lighter. He thought of the countless steps they had taken, the fear and despair pressing like stone, and yet he thought of the moments of small courage too. The decision to follow Rick, to step into the unknown, to hold on even when everything inside screamed to stop. Those choices lingered, delicate but strong. A soft breeze stirred through the chamber, carrying with it a whisper of something lost, something familiar. Morty closed his eyes, letting the warmth wash over him. Somewhere deep inside, the mountain, the monolith, the tunnels, they weren't enemies, they were mirrors. They had reflected not just fear, but resilience, curiosity, and the quiet courage of living through what seemed impossible. Rick exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the gentle glow. "Morty, some people never get a chance to see what they're capable of, but you've learned it." Morty opened his eyes. He saw the chamber not as a place of danger, but as a place of understanding. The light pulsed softly, the hum a comforting undercurrent, as if the mountain itself sighed in relief. He turned to Rick, a faint smile trembling on his lips. I think I get it now. I'm not the same Morty that came in here." Rick nodded, a faint smile flickering on his face too. "Good, that's the point. You take the lessons, not the fear. And you move forward." The chamber seemed to expand around them, the walls dissolving into soft light, the hum fading into a gentle lull. Morty felt the exhaustion of the journey settle into his bones, but it was a warm, satisfied kind of exhaustion. He felt alive, awake in a way that scared him and comforted him at once. Rick took a step back, lantern light resting on Morty's face. "You ever wonder if the universe really cares?" he asked softly. Morty shook his head, letting the light and warmth fill him. Not really, but I know we do, Rick. I know we care." Rick's lips curved in a ghost of a smile. "Yeah, Morty, that's enough sometimes. Caring." They stood there in the soft glow, listening to the faint, fading hum. Morty let his shoulders relax, letting go of the tension that had gripped him for so long. He thought of every chamber, every shadow, every whisper, and realized that the journey had given him something he hadn't expected. Quiet strength, a sense of self, and the knowledge that even in fear he could still move forward. The glow softened further, the shadows blending into calm light. Morty stepped forward slowly, feeling each footfall like a gentle promise. Rick followed, silent but steady. They walked together through the soft radiance, the mountain behind them finally at rest. Morty glanced at the light above, letting it fill him with warmth, and whispered softly, "We made it, and we're still here." Rick's hand rested lightly on his shoulder as they moved. And somewhere, the journey's still teaching Morty, even if we don't see it. The chamber dissolved into gentle light. Morty let himself exhale, deep and slow. The mountain, the tunnels, the hum, they were behind him now. Ahead, only quiet, soft space and the faint promise of peace. And as he let the calm settle into every part of him, he thought of the journey, of the fear, of the courage, of the quiet lessons that had carried him here. He smiled faintly. "Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man."